Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into the story of a man who asked for the impossible and received it. A prophet whose ministry was marked by more miracles than any other figure in the Old Testament. We're exploring Elisha, the farmer who left everything to follow a fiery prophet, who witnessed his master taken up to heaven in a whirlwind, and who inherited a double portion of prophetic power that would reshape Israel for generations. His was a ministry of extraordinary compassion and devastating power, of healings and resurrections, of mercy shown to enemies and judgment upon the proud. From multiplying oil in a widow's jars to raising the dead, from striking armies blind to ending famines with a word, Elisha proved that the God of Israel was still present, still powerful, still engaged with his people even in their darkest hours. So without further ado, let's begin. The Jordan Valley stretched green and fertile beneath the morning sun, a ribbon of life cutting through the hill country of northern Israel. In the fields near Abel Meholah, a young man guided a team of oxen through freshly turned earth, the plough cutting straight furrows in soil that had fed his family for generations. His name was Elisha, which meant God is salvation, though on this particular morning he had no reason to think his name carried any prophetic significance. He was doing what he had done countless times before, working the land, managing the labourers, overseeing the operation that marked his family as people of substance and standing in the community. The detail preserved in the text tells us something important. Elisha was ploughing with the 12th yoke of oxen. 12 teams meant 12 ploughmen working in tandem, a coordinated agricultural operation of considerable scale. This was not a subsistence farm but a prosperous enterprise, and Elisha was not a poor peasant but the son of privilege, positioned at the end of the line overseeing the work. The 11 teams ahead of him represented the breadth of his family's holdings, the security of his future, the expectations of his inheritance. Everything about his circumstances suggested a life of comfort, responsibility, and predictable prosperity stretching out before him. But the year was approximately 850 BC, and Israel was in crisis. The nation that had been forged under David and Solomon, that had known glory and unity and the manifest presence of God, had fractured and deteriorated until it was almost unrecognizable. The northern kingdom of Israel, comprising 10 tribes, had separated from Judah in the south, and in the decades since that division, it had spiraled into idolatry and moral decay with frightening speed. The current king was Ahab, 7th ruler of the northern kingdom, and under his reign the apostasy had reached new depths. It was not merely that Israel had drifted from exclusive worship of Yahweh. That had been true for generations. Under Ahab, Baal worship had been officially institutionalized, given state sponsorship and royal approval, and the driving force behind this religious revolution was Ahab's wife, the Phoenician princess Jezebel. Jezebel had come to Israel as part of a political marriage, an alliance between Ahab's father Omri and the king of Sidon. She had brought with her not just Phoenician wealth and connections, but Phoenician gods. Baal, the storm deity credited with bringing rain and fertility, and Asherah, his consort goddess. What might have remained private royal devotion became aggressive public policy. Jezebel built temples to Baal, supported hundreds of prophets of Baal and Asherah on the royal payroll, and launched a systematic campaign to eliminate the worship of Yahweh from Israel. The prophets of the Lord were hunted, killed, driven into hiding. A man named Obadiah, who served in Ahab's palace, had hidden 100 prophets in caves, feeding them secretly while Jezebel's purge raged above ground. The altars of Yahweh were torn down. The few priests who remained loyal to the God of Israel operated in constant fear. The people, seeing which way the wind was blowing, bowed to Baal, or at least hedged their bets, keeping one foot in each religious camp, calling on Yahweh when it suited them, and Baal when it seemed more advantageous. Into this spiritual darkness had come Elijah the Tishbite, a prophet unlike any Israel had seen in generations. He appeared suddenly from Gilead, east of the Jordan, dressed in a garment of hair with a leather belt around his waist, looking more like a wild man from the wilderness than a courtier. His first recorded words were spoken directly to King Ahab. As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, before whom I stand, there shall be neither dew nor rain these years, except by my word. It was a declaration of war. Elijah was announcing that the God of Israel, not Baal, the supposed storm god, controlled the weather. And to prove it, the heavens would be sealed shut. No dew, no rain, no fertility, no life, until Elijah said otherwise. Then he vanished, hidden by God first at the brook Cherith, where ravens fed him, then in Zarephath in Sidon, ironically in Jezebel's home territory, where he stayed with a widow whose oil and flour miraculously did not run out during the famine. 3 years the drought lasted. 3 years of withering crops, dying livestock, desperate hunger. 3 years in which Baal's prophets prayed and sacrificed and called on their God to send rain, to no effect. 3 years in which it became increasingly clear that either Baal was powerless or the God of Israel was superior. The theological implications were devastating for the state religion Jezebel had worked so hard to establish. Then came the confrontation on Mount Carmel, an event so dramatic it would echo through Israel's memory for centuries. Elijah challenged the 450 prophets of Baal to a test. Each side would prepare a sacrifice, and whichever God answered with fire to consume it would be proven the true deity. The prophets of Baal went first, calling on their God from morning until evening, dancing, shouting, cutting themselves in frenzied desperation. Nothing happened. The heavens remained silent, the sacrifice untouched. When Elijah's turn came, he made the test harder, drenching his sacrifice with water until it pooled around the altar. Then he prayed, not for hours but for moments, and fire fell from heaven. Not just fire on the sacrifice, but fire that consumed the sacrifice, the wood, the stones of the altar, the dust around it, and even the water in the trench. The message was unmistakable. Yahweh is God. Baal is nothing. The prophets of Baal were executed at the Kishon River. The rain returned. Elijah had won a spectacular victory, vindicating Yahweh and demonstrating his supremacy over the pagan deities. It should have been the turning point, the moment when Israel returned to their God and abandoned the false worship that had nearly destroyed them. But Jezebel was not impressed. When she heard what had happened to her prophets, she sent a message to Elijah. "So may the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by this time tomorrow." Death threat. Clear, direct, from the most powerful woman in the kingdom. And Elijah, fresh from his triumph on Carmel, suddenly broke. He ran, not to Ahab's palace to press his advantage, not to rally the people who had just witnessed God's power, but south into the wilderness, fleeing for his life. He ended up under a broom tree in the desert, so depressed he prayed for death. "It is enough. Now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am no better than my fathers." The man who had just called down fire from heaven, who had sealed and unsealed the skies, who had executed 450 false prophets, that man wanted to die because a woman threatened him. The gap between his public triumph and his private despair revealed the complexity of prophetic ministry, the toll it took on even the mightiest of God's servants. God sent an angel to feed him twice, and strengthened by that food, Elijah travelled 40 days to Mount Horeb, the mountain of God, also called Sinai. There, in a cave, God spoke to him, not in the earthquake or the wind or the fire, those dramatic displays of power that Elijah had so recently witnessed, but in a still small voice, a whisper that required quietness and attention to hear. And God gave him his next assignment. He was to anoint Hazael as king over Aram, Jehu as king over Israel, and Elisha the son of Shaphat as prophet in his place. The last instruction was crucial. Elisha would be his successor. The ministry would continue beyond Elijah. The word of the Lord would not die when Elijah died. A new prophet was to be raised up, trained, prepared to carry on the work. So Elijah left Horeb and travelled back through Israel, searching for the man God had named. He found him in the Jordan Valley near Abel Meholah, working the fields with 11 teams of oxen ahead of him and his own team bringing up the rear. The scene must have struck Elijah with its ordinariness. Here was no mystic in the wilderness, no ascetic in a cave, no wild-eyed zealot looking for adventure. Here was a prosperous farmer's son doing the work of his inheritance, embedded in community and family and the rhythms of agricultural life. Elijah approached without announcement, without explanation, without words at all. He simply took off his mantle, that distinctive hairy cloak that marked him as the prophet who had defied Ahab and defeated Baal's prophets, and threw it over Elisha's shoulders as he ploughed. The gesture was unmistakable. In the ancient Near East, to place your cloak on someone was a claim of relationship, an adoption almost, a transfer of status and authority. It was the physical symbol of spiritual reality. You are chosen, you're called, you belong to me now, you will carry on my work. No words were necessary because the action spoke with perfect clarity. Elisha understood immediately. He left his oxen standing in the field and ran after Elijah. "Let me kiss my father and my mother," he said, "and then I will follow you." It was a reasonable request, a desire to say goodbye to his parents, to explain to his family what was happening. But Elijah's response was enigmatic. "Go back again? For what have I done to you?" The words sound harsh, almost dismissive, but they were actually a test. Elijah was saying, in effect, "I've done nothing to compel you. The choice is yours. If you want to say goodbye, go ahead. If you want to stay with your family in your fields and your comfortable life, do it. But understand that following me is a decision you must make freely, not because I've forced you or manipulated you or promised you anything. What have I done to you? Nothing that removes your freedom to choose." Elisha made his choice in the most dramatic and irreversible way possible. He went back to the field, took the yoke of oxen he had been ploughing with and slaughtered them. Then he took the wooden ploughing equipment, yokes, plough, all the implements of his trade, and used them as fuel to cook the meat. It was a farewell feast for his family and the community, a public declaration that he was leaving the old life behind. By destroying his tools and sacrificing his oxen, he was burning his bridges, making return impossible. The symbolism was profound. This was not a temporary absence, not a trial period, not a leave of absence from which he could return if things did not work out. The oxen that represented wealth were dead. The equipment that represented livelihood was burned. The fields that represented inheritance were abandoned. Elisha was stepping away from security, from prosperity, from everything the world counted as success, to follow a hunted prophet into an uncertain future. And then he followed Elijah and became his attendant. The Hebrew words suggest personal service, menial work, the role of a servant to a master. This wealthy farmer's son, who had commanded labourers and managed significant agricultural operations, now carried Elijah's supplies, prepared his food, attended to his needs. It was a descent in worldly status, but an ascent in spiritual reality. To serve the prophet was to learn from him, to be formed by him, to be prepared for the calling that would one day be his own. The text does not tell us how long this apprenticeship lasted, but other historical markers suggest it was somewhere between 6 and 10 years. 6 to 10 years of service, of watching, of learning not from lectures but from life, from observing how a prophet hears from God and speaks to men, how he balances courage and wisdom, when to confront and when to remain silent, how to live in the tension between the word God gives and the reality that surrounds you. These were dangerous years. Jezebel was still hunting prophets. Ahab was still on the throne, still wavering between his father's God and his wife's deities. Baal worship continued despite Carmel. The spiritual battle that Elijah had waged so dramatically was ongoing, grinding, exhausting. And through it all, Elisha served, learned, prepared for a day he perhaps did not yet fully understand was coming. The years of apprenticeship were not wasted. Ministry, real ministry that lasts and bears fruit, cannot be built on a moment of dramatic calling alone. It requires formation, the slow work of character being shaped and tested, of gifts being discovered and refined, of learning to hear God's voice in the ordinary as well as the extraordinary. Elisha's willingness to serve before leading, to learn before teaching, to prepare before performing, would become one of the defining characteristics of his eventual ministry. The contrast between Elijah and Elisha was already becoming apparent. Elijah was the prophet of fire and judgment, dramatic and confrontational, calling down doom on the wicked and demonstrating God's power in spectacular fashion. He was a loner, isolated, living on the edges of society, appearing suddenly to deliver God's word and then vanishing again. His ministry was characterized by power displays that left no room for doubt. Fire from heaven, resurrection of the dead, drought and rain at his command. Elisha would be different. His ministry would balance judgment with mercy, power with compassion. He would work within community rather than from the margins, training schools of prophets rather than operating alone, serving as counselor to kings while also caring for widows and orphans. Where Elijah was the earthquake, Elisha would be the still small voice, no less powerful but different in expression, complementary rather than identical. But all of that lay in the future. For now, Elisha was the farmer who had left his fields, the son who had said goodbye to his family, the disciple who carried water for his master, and learned the ways of prophetic ministry through years of faithful service. He had made his choice at the plough, and that choice had set him on a path that would eventually lead to the mantle of succession, to a double portion of prophetic spirit, to a ministry that would span decades and reshape Israel. The 12 yoke of oxen were gone, slaughtered and eaten. The ploughing equipment was ashes. The comfortable life of Abel Mahola was behind him. Ahead lay years of training, a dramatic succession, and a ministry that would see more miracles than any prophet before or after him. But none of that was guaranteed when he followed Elijah away from the field. He simply knew he had been called, chosen, claimed by the prophet's mantle falling on his shoulders, and so he followed. Not knowing the full cost, not seeing the full plan, not comprehending the full scope of what God was preparing him for. He followed because the call had come, because the choice demanded a response, because some invitations from God are too significant to ignore even when, especially when, they disrupt everything you thought your life would be. The man who would become known as Elisha, the man of God, began his journey not with dramatic displays of power, but with radical obedience, not with miracles, but with service, not with a crown, but with a towel. And in that beginning, in that willingness to leave everything and follow, the foundation was laid for everything that would come after. The fields of Abel Mahola grew crops for other men that year. The family business continued without him. Life in the Jordan Valley went on as it always had, the rhythms of planting and harvest unmarked by his absence. But Elisha was being prepared for a different kind of harvest, a different kind of fruitfulness. He was being trained not to feed bodies, but to speak God's word, not to plough earth, but to prepare hearts, not to manage oxen, but to stand before kings and speak truth that could save or condemn nations. The call had come at the plough. The response had been immediate and irreversible. And somewhere in the years of service that followed, as he poured water on Elijah's hands and learned to hear the voice of God in the everyday and the extraordinary, Elisha was being transformed from a farmer into a prophet, from a comfortable son of privilege into a man who would shake kingdoms and work wonders that testified to the power and compassion of the God of Israel. The mantle had fallen on his shoulders. Now he would learn what it meant to wear it. The day began like any other in the years of Elisha's service to Elijah. But there was something different in the air, an electricity that both men could feel, though neither initially spoke of it. They were at Gilgal, one of the sacred sites of Israel's history, the place where Joshua had first camped after crossing the Jordan, where the stones of remembrance had been set up, where the new generation had been circumcised and celebrated their first Passover in the Promised Land. It was a place heavy with memory, appropriate for what was about to unfold. Elijah turned to his attendant and said, "Stay here, for the Lord has sent me as far as Bethel." The instruction was clear, the dismissal plain. But Elisha's response was immediate and emphatic. "As the Lord lives, and as you yourself live, I will not leave you." It was an oath, binding and serious, the kind of declaration that could not be easily ignored. So they went down to Bethel together, master and disciple, the older prophet and the younger man who would not be left behind. At Bethel, they encountered the sons of the prophets, members of one of the prophetic communities that had somehow survived Jezebel's purges. These were men who had been trained in the ways of God, who lived together and studied together and sought to keep alive the knowledge of Yahweh in a nation that was forgetting him. They came out to Elisha, notably to Elisha, not to Elijah, and asked him a question that revealed they knew something momentous was happening. Do you know that today the Lord will take away your master from over you? Elisha's response was terse. Yes, I know. Keep quiet. The Hebrew suggests more than a simple request for silence. There was an edge to it, a don't speak of it quality that indicated how painful the knowledge was. He knew. Of course he knew. But knowing and being ready to face it were two different things, and he did not want these well-meaning prophets putting into words what he was trying to hold together in his heart. From Bethel, Elijah again tried to leave him behind. Elisha, stay here, for the Lord has sent me to Jericho. And again, Elisha refused with the same binding oath. As the Lord lives, and as you yourself live, I will not leave you. So they came to Jericho together, descending from the hill country toward the Jordan Valley, following the same route Joshua's army had taken centuries before when they first entered the land. At Jericho the pattern repeated. The sons of the prophets came out. There was a prophetic community here too, testimony to the fact that even in Israel's darkest hours, there were those who maintained faithfulness to God, and they asked Elisha the same question. Do you know that today the Lord will take away your master from over you? And he gave them the same answer. Yes, I know. Keep quiet. 3 times now Elisha had been given the opportunity to stay behind, to let his master go on alone, to avoid whatever was coming. 3 times he had refused. The testing was deliberate, purposeful. Would he be faithful to the end? Would he persist when given every reasonable excuse to stop? Would he follow even when the journey led to loss? From Jericho, Elijah made one more attempt. Stay here, for the Lord has sent me to the Jordan. And for the 3rd time, Elisha swore the oath that bound him to his master. As the Lord lives, and as you yourself live, I will not leave you. So the 2 of them went on together, master and disciple united in their final journey. But they were not alone. 50 men from the sons of the prophets followed at a distance, witnesses to whatever was about to happen. They did not come close. There was something too sacred, too personal about this final journey between master and disciple. But they came close enough to see, to testify later about what had happened, to confirm that what Elisha would claim was true. The group arrived at the Jordan River, that boundary between wilderness and promise, between wandering and arriving, between death and life. The Jordan had been the site of so many significant moments in Israel's history. Here Joshua had led the people across on dry ground, the waters miraculously parting just as the Red Sea had parted for Moses. Here Naaman the Syrian would soon come to be healed of his leprosy. Here, centuries in the future, Jesus would be baptized by John. The river was more than geography. It was theology, a symbol of crossing over, of transformation, of God's intervention in the natural world to accomplish his purposes. Elijah took his mantle, that same distinctive cloak he had thrown over Elisha years before at the plough, the garment that had become the symbol of prophetic authority and calling, and rolled it up. Then he struck the water with it. The Jordan, swollen with the spring runoff from the mountains, divided. The waters parted, piling up on one side and draining away on the other, leaving a path of dry ground across the riverbed. It was Joshua's miracle repeated, Moses' miracle echoed, a demonstration that the same God who had led Israel's ancestors still worked through his prophets. Elijah and Elisha crossed on dry ground, the 50 witnesses watching from the western bank. When they reached the other side, when they were alone on the eastern shore with the Jordan between them and everyone else, Elijah finally spoke the words that had been building through this entire journey. Ask what I shall do for you before I am taken from you. It was an extraordinary offer, a blank check from a prophet who had called down fire from heaven and raised the dead. Elisha could have asked for anything: wealth, power, influence, recognition, An easy life, protection from enemies. But he did not hesitate. He knew exactly what he wanted, had probably been thinking about it through all those years of service, through the long apprenticeship watching his master operate in prophetic power. Please let there be a double portion of your spirit on me. The request was audacious, almost shocking in its boldness. A double portion was the inheritance right of the firstborn son, according to Deuteronomy 21:17. When a father died, his estate was divided among his sons. But the firstborn received twice the share of each other son, not twice the total estate, but twice what each brother received. It was the mark of primary heir, the one who would carry on the family name and legacy. Elisha was asking to be Elijah's spiritual firstborn, to inherit not just a share of the prophetic spirit, but the primary portion, to be the one who would carry on and even exceed his master's ministry. It was not a request for more comfort or easier circumstances. If anything, a double portion of Elijah's spirit meant a double portion of his sufferings, his conflicts, his opposition. But it was a request for effectiveness, for power to accomplish God's purposes, for the ability to continue the work that Elijah had begun. Elijah's response revealed how difficult a thing Elisha had asked. You have asked a hard thing. The Hebrew suggests something that is not within Elijah's power to grant, something that only God could do. Elijah could not simply transfer his anointing as one might transfer property. The Spirit of God was not something to be controlled or manipulated or passed along at human discretion. And yet, there was a condition, a test of spiritual perception that would indicate whether God intended to grant this request. Yet if you see me as I am being taken from you, it shall be so for you, but if you do not see me, it shall not be so. If you see me. Not just physical sight, but spiritual perception, the ability to perceive what is happening in the realm beyond the natural, to recognize God's activity, even in its most dramatic and mysterious form. The condition itself was a test. Would Elisha have the spiritual eyes to see what God was doing, even as his heart was breaking at the loss of his master? So they walked on together, talking as they went. The text does not record their conversation, those final words between master and disciple, between the man who had given everything to follow and the man who had invested years in training him. What do you say in those last moments? How do you sum up years of service, of learning, of relationship? How does a spiritual father prepare his son for life without him? Then suddenly, dramatically, the moment arrived. A chariot of fire appeared, drawn by horses of fire, a manifestation of divine presence so overwhelming it required the language of fire to describe it. The chariot came between them, separating master from disciple, and in that separation Elijah was taken up by a whirlwind into heaven. Elisha saw it all. The chariot, the horses, the whirlwind, his master ascending, being taken from earth to heaven without passing through death. And in that moment of seeing, Elisha cried out, "My father! My father!" The chariots of Israel and its horsemen. It was a cry of recognition, of anguish, of prophetic insight. The chariots of Israel, not literal military vehicles, but the true defense of the nation. Elijah had been Israel's protection, its strength, its connection to the power of God. The horsemen, not human cavalry, but the angelic forces that had just appeared. Elisha saw in that moment what Elijah had been, more valuable to Israel's security than all her armies, more powerful than all her weapons, the living link between heaven and earth. Then Elijah was gone. The whirlwind carried him away until Elisha could see him no more. The sky cleared, the chariot vanished, and Elisha stood alone on the eastern side of the Jordan, the last sight of his master fading into the heavens, his cry still echoing in his own ears. In his grief, Elisha tore his own clothes. It was the traditional sign of mourning, of devastating loss, but it was also symbolic of something deeper. He was tearing away his old identity, his old life as Elijah's servant, his role as the follower. The rending of his garments marked a death, not Elijah's death, for Elijah had not died, but the death of Elisha's apprenticeship, the end of one season and the violent transition to another. Then he saw it. Lying on the ground where Elijah had stood moments before, the mantle, that same cloak that had been thrown over him at the plough, that had parted the Jordan an hour ago, that had marked Elijah as the prophet of God, it had fallen from him as he ascended. Whether it slipped from his shoulders in the whirlwind or whether he's deliberately left it behind, the text does not say. But there it was, waiting. Elisha picked up the mantle. The weight of it in his hands was not just physical. It was the weight of calling, of responsibility, of succession. He had asked for a double portion, and the condition had been if you see me being taken. He had seen. The horses and chariot of fire, the whirlwind, the ascension. He had witnessed it all with eyes that had been opened to perceive the spiritual reality behind the physical event. And now the mantle, the symbol of prophetic authority, was in his hands. He walked back to the Jordan, the river that now stood between him and Israel, between this moment of supernatural encounter and the mission that awaited him. On the other side, the 50 sons of the prophets watched. They had seen the whirlwind, had witnessed something extraordinary, but from their distance they could not have seen what Elisha saw, could not have heard the cry about chariots and horsemen, did not know yet whether the succession had been granted. Elisha stood at the water's edge holding the mantle. This was the moment of testing, the proof of whether his request had been granted, whether he had truly inherited not just Elijah's cloak, but his spiritual authority. He took the mantle and struck the water just as Elijah had done hours before. But as he struck, he cried out, "Where is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" It was a question, but also a declaration. Where is the God who parted these waters for my master? Where is the power that worked through him? Is that same God present with me? Will he work through me as he worked through Elijah? The question hung in the air as the mantle struck the water, and the waters parted. Just as they had for Elijah, the Jordan divided, piling up on one side and draining away on the other. The God of Elijah was there. The power had not departed with the prophet. The succession was confirmed not by human approval or institutional endorsement, but by divine demonstration. God himself answered Elisha's question by opening a path across the river. Elisha crossed on dry ground, walking back into Israel not as Elijah's servant but as his successor, not as the student but as the prophet, not as the one who carried water but as the one who commanded it. The transition was complete, the succession accomplished, the double portion granted. The 50 sons of the prophets who had watched from a distance saw the waters part for Elisha, and they understood. They came to meet him, and when they reached him, they bowed to the ground before him. "The spirit of Elijah rests on Elisha," they declared. It was not flattery but recognition, not politics but prophetic discernment. They saw what had happened, understood what it meant, acknowledged the authority that now rested on this man who had been faithful enough to refuse 3 dismissals and spiritually perceptive enough to see what others could not. But the sons of the prophets, for all their recognition, still struggled with what had happened. They came to Elisha with a proposal. "Behold, there are with your servants 50 strong men. Please let them go and seek your master. It may be that the Spirit of the Lord has caught him up and cast him upon some mountain or into some valley." They had seen the whirlwind, but they had not seen what Elisha saw. Perhaps, they reasoned, Elijah had been transported somewhere, deposited on a distant mountain, and they could find him and bring him back. Elisha refused. "You shall not send." He knew what they did not. Elijah had not been relocated but translated, not transported but transformed, taken into heaven itself without passing through death. There would be no finding him on a mountain or in a valley, but they urged him until he was ashamed to refuse, until the social pressure and their earnest desire overwhelmed his better judgment, and he finally said, "Send." So they sent 50 men who searched for 3 days, scouring the mountains and valleys, looking for a man who had been taken to heaven. They found nothing, of course, because there was nothing to find. When they returned to Elisha, who had waited at Jericho, he did not gloat or say, "I told you so." He simply observed, "Did I not say to you, do not go?" It was a gentle reminder that the new prophet's word should be heeded, that when he said something, even if it seemed strange or unlikely, there was divine authority behind it. The request for a double portion had been granted. The condition had been met. Elisha had seen the chariots and horses of fire, had witnessed the translation of his master, had perceived the spiritual reality behind the physical event. The mantle had fallen to him. The waters had parted at his command. The sons of the prophets had acknowledged his authority. The succession was complete in every way that mattered. But what did it mean to inherit a double portion? The answer would unfold over the decades of ministry that followed, as Elisha performed miracle after miracle, demonstrating power that matched and indeed exceeded his master's. Where Elijah had performed 8 recorded miracles, Elisha would perform 16, literally double. Where Elijah's ministry had been concentrated and dramatic, Elisha's would be sustained and comprehensive. Where Elijah had operated primarily alone, Elisha would build and maintain communities of prophets. Where Elijah had specialized in judgment and confrontation, Elisha would balance power with mercy, demonstrating both the severity and the kindness of God. The journey from Gilgal to Bethel to Jericho to the Jordan had been more than geographic. It was theological, symbolic, a progression through Israel's sacred history toward the moment of succession. Gilgal, where Israel had first entered the land. Bethel, where Abraham and later Jacob had encountered God. Jericho, where Joshua had won his first victory. The Jordan, where so many transformative crossings had occurred. Each location carried weight, memory, significance. The journey itself prepared both master and disciple for what was coming, forced them to face the reality of separation, tested Elisha's commitment at each stage, and through it all the sons of the prophets had been there, asking their uncomfortable question. Do you know that today the Lord will take your master from you? Yes, Elisha knew. The knowledge sat heavy on him, but it did not deter him. He would not leave his master, would not take the easy path of staying behind, would not protect himself from the pain of witnessing the separation. And in his refusal to avoid the hard thing, in his determination to see it through to the end, he positioned himself to receive what he had asked for. The double portion was not given because Elisha was more talented or more naturally gifted than other potential successors. It was given because he had proven faithful in service, persistent in following, willing to face loss, and spiritually perceptive enough to see what God was doing even in the midst of personal grief. The years of pouring water on Elijah's hands, of menial service, of learning in obscurity, all of it had been preparation for this moment when the mantle would pass and the Spirit would be doubled. Standing on the western bank of the Jordan after parting the waters, wearing Elijah's mantle, acknowledged by the prophetic communities, Elisha was no longer the wealthy farmer's son from Abel Meholah. He was no longer the student, the assistant, the one who waited in the shadows while his master operated in the spotlight. He was Elisha the prophet, the man of God, the one through whom the Lord would work wonders for the next 50 years, demonstrating again and again that the God of Israel was not absent, not defeated, not powerless, but active and engaged with his people. The transition was complete. The disciple had become the prophet. The double portion had been granted, and Israel, still struggling under the weight of Baal worship and corrupt leadership, still suffering from the spiritual decay that had nearly destroyed it, was about to witness a ministry that would reshape their understanding of God's power and compassion. The mantle had passed, the waters had parted, the Spirit had been doubled, and the story of Elisha, the prophet of miracles and mercy, was just beginning. The city of Jericho had a problem. Not the problem of armies at its gates or political intrigue in its councils, but something more insidious, more persistent. The water was bad, and the land was unfruitful. For a city whose very existence depended on its oasis in the Jordan Valley, this was more than an inconvenience. It was an existential threat. The spring that should have brought life instead brought death, its waters tainted, causing miscarriages and making the land around it barren. The men of the city came to Elisha with their problem. It was a remarkable act of faith, approaching this new prophet whose succession had just been confirmed, whose ministry was just beginning. They came not with skepticism, but with hope, presenting their need plainly. Behold, the situation of this city is pleasant, as my Lord sees, but the water is bad and the land is unfruitful." Elisha's response was simple, practical. "Bring me a new bowl and put salt in it." They brought it to him, this vessel that had never been used for any other purpose, filled with salt. Then Elisha went out to the spring, to the source of the problem, and threw the salt into the water. As he did so, he spoke the prophetic word, "Thus says the Lord, I have healed this water. From now on neither death nor miscarriage shall come from it." The healing was immediate and permanent. The water became wholesome, the land fertile. And it remained so, the text emphasizes, according to the word that Elisha spoke. Here, at the very beginning of his ministry, Elisha established a pattern that would mark all his years: miracles that brought life where there had been death, provision where there had been lack, healing where there had been sickness. The God of Israel was not merely powerful but compassionate, not merely able to judge but eager to restore. Yet not all of Elisha's early ministry was characterized by such gracious acts. From Jericho he went up to Bethel, climbing from the valley into the hill country, and there he encountered a different kind of reception. Small boys, or perhaps young men, the Hebrew is ambiguous, came out of the city and jeered at him. "Go up, you bald head! Go up, you bald head!" The mockery seems trivial on its surface, juvenile name-calling that hardly seems to warrant a response. But there was more happening here than simple rudeness. Bethel was significant. It had been one of the centres of calf worship that Jeroboam had established when the northern kingdom split from Judah, an alternative worship site designed to keep people from going to Jerusalem. To mock the prophet at Bethel was to express the city's rejection of Yahweh's messenger, to side with the false worship that had corrupted Israel. The "go up" may have been a sneering reference to Elijah's ascension. "You claim your master went up, then go up yourself, baldhead. Get out of here. We don't want your God or your message." Elisha turned around, looked at them, and pronounced a curse in the name of the Lord. 2 female bears came out of the woods and mauled 42 of the youths. It was a shocking, violent response that has troubled readers for millennia. How could a prophet of mercy, a man who had just healed Jericho's waters, curse children to death? The incident reveals something important about prophetic ministry. It operates on divine authority, and that authority encompasses both mercy and judgment, both healing and harm, both blessing and curse. To reject God's prophet is to reject God himself, and such rejection carries consequences. The bears were not Elisha's vengeance, but God's judgment on a city that had chosen false worship and was teaching its next generation to mock those who represented true worship. The number 42 suggests this was not a handful of small children, but a significant mob of young people, old enough to understand what they were doing, engaging in coordinated rejection of the prophet. The contrast between Jericho and Bethel established early in Elisha's ministry the dual nature of the prophetic word. It brings life to those who receive it, and death to those who reject it. The prophet is not a tame figure who exists merely to comfort and encourage. He carries the authority of God, and that authority can heal springs or summon bears, can multiply food or pronounce judgment. From these early incidents, Elisha's reputation began to spread. Here was a prophet who could transform death into life with a bowl of salt, who could call down divine judgment on mockers, who walked in the authority his master had carried. And as his reputation grew, so did the appeals for help from those who had nowhere else to turn. A widow came to him, desperate and terrified. She was the wife of one of the sons of the prophets, part of that community of men who studied and preserved the knowledge of God. Her husband had died, and now the creditor was coming to take her 2 children as slaves to satisfy the debt. It was legal, but devastating. The kind of transaction that reduced the vulnerable to property, that turned tragedy into trafficking. She appealed to Elisha, and her opening words revealed her situation. "Your servant my husband is dead, and you know that your servant feared the Lord, but the creditor has come to take my 2 children to be his slaves." Her husband had been faithful, had served God, had been part of the prophetic community, and yet here she was, facing the loss of everything. Where was God's provision for those who served him? Elisha's first question was practical. "What shall I do for you? Tell me, "What have you in the house?" She had nothing, she said. Nothing except a jar of oil. It seemed an insignificant resource, hardly worth mentioning. Just a small amount of oil, perhaps enough for a few days' use at most. But Elisha saw possibility where she saw destitution. "Go outside, borrow vessels from all your neighbours, empty vessels and not too few," he instructed her. Then, once she'd gathered the containers, "Go in and shut the door behind yourself and your sons and pour into all these vessels, and when one is full, set it aside." The instructions were strange. Pour from one jar into many. How could that possibly work? But the widow obeyed. She shut the door. This miracle would happen in private, in the secret place where God meets faith, and began to pour. The oil flowed. She filled one vessel, set it aside, filled another. Her sons brought her container after container, and the oil kept flowing. The small jar in her hand proved inexhaustible, pouring out abundance that defied all natural explanation. Finally she said to her son, "Bring me another vessel," and he answered, "There is not another." Only then did the oil stop. The miracle was limited not by God's power, but by her preparation, by the number of vessels she had gathered. If she had borrowed more, there would have been more. The divine supply exceeded even her expanded faith. She came and told Elisha, and his instruction was beautifully simple. "Go, sell the oil and pay your debts, and you and your sons can live on the rest." The miracle was not just enough to meet the immediate crisis, but enough to provide ongoing support. God's provision exceeded mere survival, giving her not just freedom from slavery for her sons, but resources to live, to thrive, to move forward rather than merely survive. The story spread, as such stories do. The God of Israel cared for widows. The prophet who carried his authority could multiply provision for those who had nothing. And soon another woman heard of Elisha and determined to show him hospitality. She lived in Shunem, a town in the Jezreel Valley, and she was described as a great woman, a phrase suggesting wealth, status, influence. She saw Elisha passing through regularly and urged him to stop for a meal. After he had done so several times, she spoke to her husband with a proposal. "Behold now, I know that this is a holy man of God who is continually passing our way. Let us make a small room on the roof, and put there for him a bed, a table, a chair, and a lamp, so that whenever he comes to us, he can go in there." It was an act of pure hospitality, of providing for God's servant without any apparent expectation of return. They built the room, furnished it simply but adequately, and made it available to Elisha whenever he needed it. It became a sanctuary for him, a place of rest in the midst of his travels, a physical expression of honour for his prophetic calling. One day, resting in that upper room, Elisha said to his servant Gehazi, "Call this Shunammite." When she came and stood before him, he asked Gehazi what could be done for her. Had she sacrificed for his comfort? How could he repay her? Did she need anything spoken to the king or the commander of the army? She declined. "I dwell among my own people," she said. She had no requests, no needs that required prophetic intervention or political influence. She had acted out of pure hospitality, expecting nothing in return. But Gehazi, observing, saw what she did not say. Well, she has no son, and her husband is old. In that culture, at that time, this was tragedy. A woman without a son, married to a man past the age of fathering children. She faced a future without heir, without the security children provided, without the joy that motherhood brought. It was a grief she had learned to carry quietly, a loss she had accepted as unchangeable. Elisha called her again, and when she stood in the doorway, the text carefully notes she stood in the doorway, not fully entering, maintaining appropriate boundaries with the prophet, he spoke words that must have seemed impossible. "About this time next year you shall embrace a son." Her response revealed the depth of her pain and the caution of her hope. "No, my lord, O man of God, do not lie to your servant. Don't deceive me. Don't give me false hope. Don't make me believe in something that can't happen. I've made peace with my barrenness. Don't unsettle that peace with promises that won't come true." But it was not a false promise. According to the word that Elisha had spoken, the woman conceived, and she bore a son about that time the following year. The miracle came exactly as promised. The impossible made real. The barren womb opened. She had asked for nothing, expected nothing, and received everything she could have wanted but was afraid to hope for. The child grew, as children do, and became the joy of his parents' later years. But then, when he was still young, tragedy struck. He was out in the field with his father during harvest, and suddenly he cried out, "My head, my head." The father told a servant to carry him to his mother, and the boy sat on her lap until noon, and then he died. We can only imagine her shock, her grief, her confusion. The promised child, the gift she had been afraid to hope for, had been given and now was taken away. Why? What purpose could this serve? But in her grief she acted with remarkable faith and determination. She carried the dead child up to Elisha's room and laid him on the prophet's bed. Then she shut the door and went out, telling no one what had happened. She called her husband and asked for a servant and a donkey. "I will go to the man of God and come back." Her husband questioned her. Why today? It was neither new moon nor Sabbath, neither a festival nor any special occasion that would warrant such a journey. "All is well," she said. The Hebrew word is shalom, peace, wholeness, rightness. It was not literally true, but it expressed her faith that it would be true, that God would make it true through his prophet. She saddled the donkey and rode to Mount Carmel, where Elisha was. When the man of God saw her in the distance, he said to Gehazi, "Look, there is the Shunammite. Run at once to meet her and say to her, 'Is all well with you? Is all well with your husband? Is all well with the child?'" Gehazi ran and asked the questions, and she answered him as she had answered her husband, "All is well." Then she came to Elisha and caught hold of his feet. Gehazi moved to push her away. This was inappropriate, too familiar, unseemly behaviour toward the prophet. But Elisha stopped him. "Leave her alone, for she is in bitter distress, and the Lord has hidden it from me and has not told me." Even prophets do not know everything. Even those who hear from God regularly can be kept in the dark about specific situations until the time is right. God had not told Elisha what had happened, and now he was about to find out. The woman spoke, and her words carried accusation wrapped in faith. "Did I ask my Lord for a son? Did I not say, 'Do not deceive me'? This is why I was afraid to hope. This is why I told you not to give me false promises. You gave me a son. I dared to love him, and now he's been taken away. The gift has become torment." Elisha understood immediately. He said to Gehazi, "Tie up your garment and take my staff in your hand and go. If you meet anyone, do not greet him, and if anyone greets you, do not reply. And lay my staff on the face of the child." It was an attempt to work the miracle at a distance, to send his authority through his servant and his staff. Gehazi ran ahead, laid the staff on the child's face, but there was no sound, no sign of life. He returned to meet Elisha and reported, "The child has not awakened." Sometimes miracles require the personal presence of the one through whom God works. Sometimes there are no shortcuts, no delegation, no working at a distance. Elisha had to go himself. When he came into the house, he went up to his room where the dead child lay on his bed. He shut the door on the two of them and prayed to the Lord. This was not public display but private intercession, not performance but desperation. A child was dead, and only God could give life back. Then Elisha did something strange and intimate. He went up and lay on the child, putting his mouth on his mouth, his eyes on his eyes, his hands on his hands. He stretched himself upon him, and the flesh of the child became warm. It was an extraordinary moment. The prophet of God lying on a dead child, breathing into his mouth, warming his cold flesh with his own body heat. It was not magic, but ministry. Not technique, but desperation expressed in physical form. Elisha got up, walked back and forth in the house once, then went up again and stretched himself upon him. And this time the child sneezed 7 times, and the child opened his eyes. Life returned, death fled. The impossible became real once more. Elisha called Gehazi and said, "Call this Shunammite." When she came, he said, "Pick up your son." She came and fell at his feet, bowing to the ground in gratitude and worship. Then she picked up her son and went out. The text does not record her words because none were needed. What could she say that her actions did not already express? The prophet who had promised her a son when she had given up hope had now raised that son from death. The God who gave life was also the God who could restore it, who could reverse death itself, who could answer the desperate prayers of those who had nowhere else to turn. These miracles established Elisha's reputation throughout Israel. Here was a prophet who could heal springs and multiply oil, who could promise children to the barren and raise the dead to life. But his ministry was not confined to individual acts of compassion. He also served the prophetic communities, those groups of men who studied and preserved the knowledge of God in a nation that was forgetting him. During a famine, Elisha was with the sons of the prophets at Gilgal. He told his servant to put on the large pot and make stew for the prophets. One of them went out into the field to gather herbs, found a wild vine, and gathered from it his lap full of wild gourds. He came and cut them up into the pot of stew, not knowing what they were. When the stew was poured out for the men to eat, they cried out, "O man of God, there is death in the pot." The gourds were poisonous, the stew inedible, and in a time of famine this was disaster. Precious food rendered deadly. Elisha said, "Bring flour." He threw it into the pot and said, "Pour some out for the men, that they may eat." And there was no harm in the pot. The poison was neutralized, the death transformed into nourishment. It was a simple miracle in some ways, not as dramatic as raising the dead or multiplying oil, but it revealed the same truth. The God who works through his prophet can transform death into life, can take what would harm and make it heal. On another occasion, a man came from Baal-Shalisha bringing Elisha bread of the firstfruits, 20 loaves of barley and fresh ears of grain. Elisha said to his servant, "Give to the men, that they may eat." But Gehazi objected. "How can I set this before 100 men?" It was a reasonable question. 20 loaves were not enough to feed 100 hungry men, especially in a time of famine when every scrap of food was precious. But Elisha insisted, "Give them to the men, that they may eat. For thus says the Lord, they shall eat and have some left." So Gehazi set it before them, and they ate and had some left over, according to the word of the Lord. It was a miracle that would be echoed centuries later by another prophet, another teacher who would take a few loaves and feed thousands with abundance left over. The principle remained constant. God's provision through his servants exceeds natural limitations, multiplying what seems insufficient into abundance. These miracles of mercy and power established Elisha as fundamentally different from his predecessor. Elijah had been the prophet of dramatic confrontation, calling down fire from heaven, pronouncing drought and famine, executing false prophets. His miracles were spectacular but relatively few, 8 recorded in total. Elisha's ministry was marked by a different rhythm. Where Elijah confronted kings and priests, Elisha helped widows and fed prophets. Where Elijah's miracles were often judgments, Elisha's were overwhelmingly mercies. Yet there was power alongside the compassion. The bears that mauled the mockers at Bethel demonstrated that judgment remained part of the prophetic arsenal, that God's kindness did not negate his severity, that those who rejected his messengers would face consequences. But the dominant note was mercy. Healing waters, multiplying oil, promised children, resurrection from death, purified stew, multiplied bread. Again and again, Elisha demonstrated that the God of Israel was not distant or uncaring, not merely powerful but deeply compassionate, not just able to judge but eager to provide. His miracles were not random acts of power but responses to real human need. The widow facing slavery for her children, the wealthy woman who ached for a son, the prophetic community threatened by poisoned food and insufficient provisions. These were not abstractions, but people with names and faces and desperate situations. And Elisha, carrying the double portion of prophetic spirit he had requested, brought the power of God to bear on their problems, demonstrating again and again that faith in Yahweh was not misplaced, that the God who seemed absent was actually intimately engaged with the details of his people's lives. The upper room in Shunem became a kind of symbol for Elisha's ministry, a place of rest built by human hospitality, where divine power operated to bring life from death. The widow's house where oil multiplied demonstrated that God's provision begins with what we have, however little, and multiplies it beyond our imagining when we offer it in faith. The pot of poisoned stew transformed by flour showed that God can neutralize what would harm us, can take even our mistakes and desperate measures and make them serve his purposes. And through it all, Elisha remained the man of God, approachable yet authoritative, compassionate yet powerful, serving individuals while never losing sight of the larger mission of calling Israel back to faithfulness. The double portion he had requested was being demonstrated not just in the number of miracles but in their nature. Where Elijah's power had been concentrated and confrontational, Elisha's was sustained and merciful. Both came from the same God, both served the same purpose, but they expressed divine character in complementary rather than identical ways. The years were passing, and with each miracle, Elisha's reputation grew. He was becoming not just a successor to Elijah, but a prophet in his own right, with his own distinctive ministry, his own relationship with God, his own legacy being written. And the miracles of mercy and power were only beginning. The widow's oil had multiplied, the Shunammite's son had been raised, the poisoned stew had been purified, the insufficient bread had fed 100. But greater miracles were coming. International conflicts would require prophetic intervention. Kings would seek his counsel. Enemies would be healed and humbled. And through it all, Elisha would continue to demonstrate that the God who heals, springs and raises the dead is also the God who shapes the destiny of nations, who works through his servants to accomplish purposes that stretch far beyond individual acts of compassion into the realm of political and spiritual transformation. The man who had picked up Elijah's fallen mantle was walking in the authority it represented. The double portion was being demonstrated with each miracle. And Israel, slowly, was learning that the God who had worked through Elijah was still present, still powerful, still engaged with his people through the prophet who had refused to leave his master's side, who had witnessed the chariot of fire, who had parted the Jordan with a word. The miracles of mercy and power were testimony to a truth Israel desperately needed to remember. They were not abandoned, not forgotten, not beyond the reach of God's compassion or the scope of his power. Even in their apostasy, even in their unfaithfulness, God was still working among them through his prophet, still bringing life from death, still multiplying insufficient resources into abundance, still responding to faith with provision that exceeded expectation. Elisha the prophet, the man of God, the successor to Elijah, he was becoming the living demonstration that God had not given up on his people, that mercy was still available, that power was still present, that faith could still move the hand of heaven to intervene in the affairs of earth. The prophet who healed springs and multiplied oil was not content to minister only to widows and prophetic communities. Elisha's calling extended beyond individual compassion into the dangerous arena of national politics, where kings made decisions that shaped the destiny of nations and where a wrong word to the wrong ruler could mean death. Yet Elisha moved in these spaces with the same authority he brought to the widow's house, speaking truth to power with a boldness that could only come from knowing he represented the King of Kings. Mesha, king of Moab, had been a vassal to Israel for years, paying tribute of 100,000 lambs and the wool of 100,000 rams. It was a staggering amount, a symbol of Israel's dominance over their neighbour to the east. But when Ahab died, Mesha saw opportunity. He rebelled, refusing to pay the tribute, asserting Moab's independence. The Moabite stone, a monument Mesha erected to commemorate his achievements, records his perspective on this conflict. A rare instance where we have both biblical and extra-biblical accounts of the same events, each side telling its story in stone and in scripture. Ahab's son Jehoram now sat on Israel's throne. He had removed the pillar of Baal that his father had made, a small step toward religious reform, but the text is clear that he still clung to the sins of Jeroboam, maintaining the calf worship that had corrupted Israel from the beginning of the divided kingdom. He was better than his father, but not by much, a man who made token gestures toward Yahweh without genuine commitment. When Mesha rebelled, Jehoram faced a choice: accept the loss of tribute and the humiliation of a successful revolt, or march to war and reassert Israel's dominance. He chose war, but he was wise enough to know he could not do it alone. He sent word to Jehoshaphat, king of Judah. The king of Moab has rebelled against me. Will you go with me to battle against Moab? It was the same Jehoshaphat who had earlier allied with Ahab, a righteous king who made the repeated mistake of entangling Judah with Israel's corrupt rulers. Once again, he agreed. I will go. I am as you are, my people as your people, my horses as your horses. But Jehoshaphat added a crucial condition. They should inquire of the Lord before going to battle. It was a reminder that however powerful armies might be, however brilliant military strategy might seem, success ultimately depended on divine favour. But Jehoram had a problem. He had no legitimate prophet of Yahweh readily available. The spiritual infrastructure that should have supported Israel's king had been decimated by years of persecution and neglect. The alliance expanded to include Edom, whose king also agreed to join the campaign. The strategy was to march south through the wilderness of Edom, approaching Moab from an unexpected direction rather than taking the direct route that Mesha would be prepared to defend. It was clever tactically but logistically challenging. The wilderness was harsh, water scarce, and an army with horses and livestock would need substantial resources to survive the journey. 7 days into the march, disaster struck. There was no water for the army or for the animals. The 3 kings had led their forces into the wilderness, and now they were trapped, too far in to easily retreat, not far enough to reach water, vulnerable and desperate. Jehoram's response revealed his spiritual condition. Alas! The Lord has called these 3 kings to give them into the hand of Moab. He blamed God for the crisis, assumed divine intention was hostile, saw judgment rather than seeking help. But Jehoshaphat asked a different question. Is there no prophet of the Lord here, through whom we may inquire of the Lord? One of Jehoram's servants answered, Elisha the son of Shaphat is here, who poured water on the hands of Elijah. The description was telling. Elisha was known not for his own miracles yet, but for his service to Elijah, identified by his faithful attendance to his master, but that was enough. If he'd been Elijah's servant, he carried Elijah's authority. The 3 kings went down to Elisha. The prophet was with the army, travelling among the people, available even in this military campaign. When Jehoram approached, Elisha's response was withering. What have I to do with you? Go to the prophets of your father and the prophets of your mother. It was a scathing dismissal, a reminder that Jehoram's parents, Ahab and Jezebel, had supported hundreds of false prophets while persecuting the prophets of Yahweh. You want prophetic guidance now? Go ask the prophets you and your family preferred. Jehoram protested. No, it is the Lord who has called these 3 kings to give them into the hand of Moab. He was still blaming God, still seeing the crisis as divine hostility rather than the natural consequence of poor planning. But his very presence before Elisha, his very request for help contradicted his words. If he truly believed God was determined to destroy them, why seek a prophet's intervention? Elisha's answer revealed the only reason he would help. As the Lord of hosts lives, before whom I stand, were it not that I have regard for Jehoshaphat the king of Judah, I would neither look at you nor see you. The contempt was palpable. Elisha had no patience for Jehoram's half-hearted reforms, his token gestures toward Yahweh while maintaining the essential structure of Israel's apostasy. But Jehoshaphat was different, a king who genuinely sought the Lord, who inquired of prophets before battles, who at least attempted to lead his people in faithfulness. For Jehoshaphat's sake, Elisha would help, but first he needed to hear from God. Now bring me a musician, Elisha commanded. When the musician played, the hand of the Lord came upon him. It was a remarkable detail. Music as a means of opening prophetic reception, creating an environment where the word of God could be clearly heard. The music played, and Elisha received the word, and when he spoke it was with absolute authority. Thus says the Lord, I will make this dry stream bed full of pools. For thus says the Lord, you shall not see wind or rain, but that stream bed shall be filled with water, so that you shall drink, you, your livestock, and your animals. This is a light thing in the sight of the Lord. He will also give the Moabites into your hand, and you shall attack every fortified city and every choice city, and shall fell every good tree and stop up all springs of water and ruin every good piece of land with stones. It was a double promise, miraculous provision and military victory. Water would come without the normal means. No wind, no rain, no storm clouds on the horizon. Just water, filling the dry valley, enough for the entire army and all the animals. And beyond provision, victory, complete devastating victory over Moab. The next morning, about the time of offering the sacrifice, water came from the direction of Edom. The valley filled with water, exactly as Elisha had said. The army drank, the animals drank, strength returned, hope revived. The crisis that had seemed insurmountable was resolved by divine intervention through prophetic word. Meanwhile, the Moabites heard that the kings had come up to fight against them. They mustered their forces at the border, ready to defend their newly asserted independence. When they rose early in the morning and the sun shone on the water, it appeared red to them, the colour of blood. They jumped to a conclusion. This is blood. The kings have surely fought together and struck one another down. Now then, Moab to the spoil. It was a fatal misreading of the situation. Assuming the alliance had collapsed into civil war, that the kings had destroyed each other, the Moabites rushed forward to plunder what they thought would be undefended camps. Instead, they found 3 armies ready for battle. Israel rose up and struck the Moabites, and the Moabites fled. The allied forces pushed deep into Moabite territory, devastating the land as Elisha had prophesied, overthrowing cities, stopping up springs, felling trees, covering good land with stones. The destruction was so complete that only Kir Hareseth, Moab's fortified capital, remained. Even there, the slingers surrounded it and attacked it. King Mesha, seeing his defeat was total, took his oldest son, who would have reigned after him, and offered him as a burnt offering on the wall. It was a desperate, horrifying act, human sacrifice to Chemosh, Moab's god, a last attempt to win divine intervention through the most extreme offering possible. The text says there came great wrath against Israel, and they withdrew. The nature of this wrath is debated. Was it divine displeasure at Israel pushing Mesha to such an extreme? Was it simply Moabite fury that made continued campaign unwise? Whatever the cause, the Allied forces withdrew, having achieved their military objective of breaking Mesha's rebellion, even if they did not completely destroy Moab. The campaign demonstrated Elisha's role in national affairs. His word had saved the army from disaster in the wilderness. His prophecy had guided their strategy. His authority had been vindicated by events. Kings might command armies, but prophets commanded the resources of heaven, and the king who dismissed the prophet did so at his peril. This pattern of prophetic involvement in royal affairs continued throughout Elisha's ministry. He was not confined to temples or prophetic schools, but moved in palaces and battlefields, speaking to kings with the same authority he brought to widows. The word of the Lord through his prophet shaped not just individual lives, but national destinies. Years later, during the reign of Jehoram and into the reign of Jehu, Elisha would play an even more dramatic role in Israel's political upheavals. The house of Ahab, which had brought Baal worship to Israel, which had persecuted the prophets and corrupted the nation, needed to be overthrown. God had told Elijah at Horeb to anoint Jehu as king over Israel, but Elijah had never completed that commission. Now, Elisha would finish what his master had been told to begin. Elisha called one of the sons of the prophets and gave him specific instructions. Take this flask of oil in your hand and go to Ramoth Gilead. When you arrive, look there for Jehu, the son of Jehoshaphat, son of Nimshi. Go in and have him rise from among his fellows and lead him to an inner chamber. Then take the flask of oil and pour it on his head and say, Thus says the Lord, I anoint you king over Israel. Then open the door and flee, do not tarry. The young prophet obeyed. He found Jehu sitting among the commanders of the army, drew him aside into an inner chamber, poured oil on his head, and delivered the prophetic commission. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I anoint you king over the people of the Lord over Israel, and you shall strike down the house of Ahab your master, so that I may avenge on Jezebel the blood of my servants the prophets, and the blood of all the servants of the Lord. It was a command for revolution, for regicide, for the complete extermination of Ahab's dynasty. The blood of the prophets Jezebel had killed, the faithful servants of Yahweh who had been hunted and murdered during Ahab's reign. That blood cried out for justice, and Jehu was anointed as the instrument of divine vengeance. Then, as instructed, the young prophet opened the door and fled. Jehu returned to his fellow commanders, who naturally wanted to know what that crazy fellow had wanted. Jehu tried to dismiss it. You know the fellow and his talk. But they pressed him. Finally he told them, "Thus and so he spoke to me, saying, 'Thus says the Lord, I anoint you king over Israel.'" The response was immediate. They took their garments and put them under Jehu on the bare steps, blew the trumpet and proclaimed, "Jehu is king." The military coup was launched, initiated by prophetic word, driven by the accumulated rage against the house of Ahab and all it represented. What followed was brutal. Jehu drove his chariot like a madman to Jezreel, where King Jehoram was recovering from wounds. He shot Jehoram with an arrow, killed him in the very field that had belonged to Naboth, the man Ahab and Jezebel had murdered to steal his vineyard. Poetic justice. The son of Ahab died in the field his parents had obtained through murder. Jehu then confronted Jezebel herself. She had painted her eyes and adorned her head, looking out the window with defiant dignity as Jehu entered the gate. "Is it peace, you Zimri, murderer of your master?" she called, comparing him to an earlier assassin who had briefly seized Israel's throne. But Jehu called up to the window, "Who is on my side?" "Who?" 2 or 3 eunuchs looked out, and Jehu commanded, "Throw her down." They threw her down, and her blood spattered on the wall and on the horses, and they trampled her. The woman who had hunted prophets, who had institutionalized Baal worship, who had dominated Israel's royal house for decades. She died thrown from a window by her own servants, trampled by horses, her blood painting the walls of the city. When they went to bury her, they found only her skull, her feet, and the palms of her hands. Dogs had eaten the rest, exactly as Elijah had prophesied years before. Jehu's purge continued. He killed all 70 of Ahab's sons, slaughtered the royal house of Judah who had come to visit, exterminated all who remained of Ahab's house in Jezreel until there was not one left. Then, with chilling deception, he gathered all the worshippers of Baal under pretense of offering a great sacrifice, and once they were assembled in Baal's temple, he had them all slaughtered. He broke down the pillar of Baal, demolished the house of Baal, and turned it into a latrine. It was systematic, brutal, complete, the kind of violence that fulfilled prophetic word but left blood on everyone's hands. The text commends Jehu for destroying Baal worship from Israel, for doing what God had commanded regarding Ahab's house. But it also notes that Jehu did not turn aside from the sins of Jeroboam. He destroyed Baal worship but maintained the calf worship that had corrupted Israel from the beginning. Even in obedience, his reformation was incomplete. Elisha's role in this revolution was indirect but crucial. By sending the prophet to anoint Jehu, he initiated the chain of events that overthrew the house of Ahab and ended Baal worship in Israel. The prophet who multiplied oil and raised the dead also toppled dynasties and reshaped the political landscape. His ministry encompassed both mercy to individuals and judgment on corrupt systems, both provision for the needy and confrontation with entrenched evil. The relationship between prophet and king was complex throughout Israel's history, but Elisha navigated it with unusual skill. He showed contempt for Jehoram's half-hearted reforms, while still providing divine guidance for Jehoshaphat's sake. He initiated Jehu's revolution, but did not personally carry out the violence. He spoke truth to power without becoming subservient to it, maintained prophetic independence, while still engaging with political realities. This was a different kind of prophetic ministry than Elijah's. Elijah had confronted Ahab directly, called down fire on his prophets, sealed the heavens at his word. Elisha worked more indirectly, speaking through intermediaries, operating from within the system rather than always from outside it, balancing judgment with mercy in ways that made him simultaneously more approachable and no less authoritative. The clash with kings revealed that prophetic authority transcended royal power. Kings commanded armies, controlled resources, made laws and enforced them, but prophets commanded the resources of heaven, spoke with divine authority, could make or break dynasties with a word. When Jehoram stood before Elisha in the wilderness, dying of thirst with his army, all his royal power meant nothing. Only the prophet could access what the king desperately needed. This was the scandal and the glory of prophetic ministry, that a man who owned nothing, commanded no armies, held no official position, could stand before kings and speak as their superior because he represented the King of Kings. Elisha's power was not in political position or military might, but in his connection to God, his ability to hear the divine word and speak it faithfully regardless of consequences. The miracles of provision, water in the wilderness, victory over Moab, demonstrated that prophetic word could reshape circumstances that seemed unchangeable. The anointing of Jehu showed that prophetic action could overthrow established orders and create new political realities. Kings might sit on thrones, but prophets determined which kings would sit and for how long. This was dangerous territory, the relationship between sacred and secular authority, between prophet and king, between the word of God and the will of rulers. These tensions could not be easily resolved. Throughout Israel's history, this dynamic would play out in various ways, sometimes with prophets supporting kings, sometimes confronting them, sometimes suffering for their faithfulness, sometimes honoured for their guidance. Elisha managed these tensions with remarkable wisdom. He honoured righteous kings like Jehoshaphat, while condemning corrupt ones like Jehoram. He initiated necessary political change while not becoming a political actor himself. He spoke divine truth into complex situations while recognizing the limits of what even prophetic authority could accomplish. The years of clashing with kings, of navigating royal courts and military campaigns, of speaking truth that could reshape nations, these were not separate from Elisha's ministry of mercy to individuals. They were the same ministry operating at a different scale, the same divine compassion and justice working through the same prophet, addressing not just personal need, but national crisis, not just individual suffering, but systemic evil. And through it all, Elisha remained the man of God, neither intimidated by power, nor corrupted by proximity to it, neither withdrawn from the world's complexities, nor absorbed by them, faithful to the calling he had received when Elijah's mantle fell on his shoulders, wielding the double portion of prophetic spirit in ways that brought both judgment and mercy, both confrontation and compassion, both political upheaval and personal healing. The widow still received multiplied oil. The Shunammite still had her son raised from death. But the kings also received prophetic word, military strategy, divine guidance. The house of Ahab fell according to prophetic decree. Baal worship was purged from Israel, and all of it, the personal and the political, the intimate and the international, the mercy and the judgment, all of it flowed from the same source, the prophet who carried God's authority and spoke his word without fear or compromise, wherever that word needed to be spoken, to whomever needed to hear it. In the great city of Damascus, capital of Aram, there lived a man whose name meant pleasant, a name that stood in cruel irony to the disease that was slowly destroying him. Naaman was commander of the army of the king of Aram, a position of immense power and prestige. The text describes him as a great man with his master and in high favour, because by him the Lord had given victory to Aram. It was a remarkable acknowledgement. The biblical writer recognized that even Israel's enemy received victories from Yahweh, that God's sovereignty extended beyond the borders of his chosen people, that he could use even foreign commanders to accomplish his purposes. Naaman was valiant, successful, honoured, feared. But the text adds one devastating qualifier. But he was a leper. In Hebrew, the conjunction but carries the weight of tragedy. All his greatness, all his military prowess, all his favour with the king, none of it could cure the disease that was eating away at his skin, that marked him as unclean, that reminded him daily that for all his power, he was powerless against this one enemy he could not defeat. Leprosy in the ancient world was a term that covered various skin diseases, not just what we now call Hansen's disease. But whatever the specific condition, it was devastating. In Israel, lepers were considered ceremonially unclean, forced to live outside the community, required to call out "unclean, unclean" when anyone approached. In Aram, the social consequences may have been less severe, but the disease was no less horrifying, slowly disfiguring, progressively debilitating, ultimately fatal. Into Naaman's household, through one of those raids that Aramean bands regularly made into Israelite territory, had come a young girl. She had been captured, torn from her family, transported to a foreign land, and made a servant to Naaman's wife. She was a slave with no power, no rights, no hope of return. She had every reason to hate her captors, to wish ill upon them, to find satisfaction in the suffering of the man whose armies had destroyed her life. But instead she showed compassion. She said to her mistress, "Would that my lord were with the prophet who is in Samaria. He would cure him of his leprosy." It was an extraordinary statement from someone with no reason to help. She could have remained silent, could have seen Naaman's disease as divine judgment, could have taken grim satisfaction in her captor's affliction. Instead, she pointed him toward healing, toward the prophet of the God of Israel, toward the possibility that even an enemy commander could find mercy. Her testimony reached Naaman's ears. What must he have thought? A servant girl from a conquered people was claiming that a prophet in Samaria could cure what all the physicians and priests of Aram could not. It seemed improbable, perhaps even laughable. Yet what did he have to lose? He was dying slowly, his disease progressing, his strength ebbing. If there was even a small chance that an Israelite prophet could help, wasn't it worth pursuing? Naaman went to the king of Aram and told him what the girl had said. The king's response revealed both his regard for Naaman and his misunderstanding of how divine healing worked. "Go now, and I will send a letter to the king of Israel." It was a diplomatic approach, king to king, the assumption being that healing was a matter of political negotiation rather than spiritual encounter. The king wrote a letter that Naaman would carry. "When this letter reaches you, know that I have sent to you Naaman my servant, that you may cure him of his leprosy." Naaman departed, taking with him impressive gifts: 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 changes of clothing. It was a fortune, the kind of payment that could secure almost anything in the ancient world. He travelled with horses and chariots, arriving at Israel's capital with all the pomp and circumstance appropriate to a commander of his rank. He was accustomed to respect, to deference, to having doors opened before him by virtue of his position and power. The letter was delivered to the king of Israel, by this time likely Jehoram, though the text does not specify. When the king read it, his response was not gratitude but panic. He tore his clothes and cried out, "Am I God to kill and to make alive that this man sends word to me to cure a man of his leprosy? Only consider and see how he is seeking a quarrel with me." The king's fear was understandable. Aram was stronger than Israel militarily. If this was a setup, send an impossible request, then use the inevitable failure as pretext for war. Israel would suffer, and the king's theological reasoning was sound. Only God could heal leprosy. He himself had no such power. But his response revealed spiritual blindness. He had in his kingdom a prophet through whom God regularly performed miracles. Water had been multiplied, the dead had been raised, armies had been saved in the wilderness. If anyone could cure leprosy, it would be Elisha. Yet the king's first thought was not to seek the prophet, but to assume international conspiracy. When Elisha heard that the king had torn his clothes, he sent word, "Why have you torn your clothes? Let him come now to me, that he may know that there is a prophet in Israel." The rebuke was subtle but clear. The king should have known this. The king should have immediately thought of God's prophet. The king's first instinct should have been to turn to divine resources rather than to political anxiety. But Elisha's primary concern was not the king's spiritual obtuseness. It was that Naaman should know there is a prophet in Israel, that he should encounter the power of the God of Israel, that this foreign commander should learn that Yahweh, not the gods of Damascus, was the source of healing. So Naaman came with his horses and chariots and stood at the door of Elisha's house. The moment must have seemed pregnant with possibility. Here was the great commander, used to deference and honour, arriving with his entourage and his wealth, ready to be received by the famous prophet. Surely there would be ceremony, ritual, appropriate recognition of his status and the significance of his journey. But Elisha did not come out. He did not meet Naaman personally, did not acknowledge his arrival with appropriate pomp, did not perform any ritual or ceremony. Instead, he sent a messenger, likely his servant Gehazi, with curt instructions. Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored, and you shall be clean. Naaman was furious. The text says he went away in a rage, feeling insulted, disrespected, dismissed. His anger poured out in wounded pride. Behold, I thought that he would surely come out to me and stand and call upon the name of the Lord his God, and wave his hand over the place and cure the leper. Naaman had come expecting a show, a demonstration of prophetic power appropriate to his status. He expected personal attention, elaborate ritual, recognition of his importance. Instead, he received a second-hand message telling him to wash in a muddy river. His anger extended to the prescription itself. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean? It was a legitimate question on the surface. The rivers of Damascus were indeed clearer, more beautiful, more impressive than the Jordan. If water was the cure, why not use superior water? But Naaman's rage revealed he had missed the point entirely. This was not about the water's quality, but about obedience to God's word through his prophet. The Jordan was specified not because of its physical properties, but because God had chosen it, because humility required going to the place designated rather than substituting a more convenient or prestigious alternative. Naaman turned to go, pride intact but healing lost, choosing dignity over deliverance, status over salvation. But his servants intervened with wisdom that cut through his pride. They came near and spoke to him carefully, addressing him with respect. My father, it is a great word the prophet has spoken to you. Will you not do it? Has he actually said to you, wash and be clean? Their logic was irrefutable. If the prophet had told you to do something difficult, some great and arduous task, some expensive sacrifice, some painful ordeal, would you not have done it? Of course you would. You came all this way expecting to have to do something significant, but he has asked for something simple. Wash and be clean. Why then refuse? What is the actual obstacle here? The task, or your pride? The servant saw what Naaman in his rage could not, that the simplicity of the command was itself a test, that healing required humility, that divine grace often comes through means that offend human pride. Great men expect great prescriptions. The powerful assume their cure will be as impressive as their status. But God's ways are not our ways, and sometimes the path to healing runs through muddy rivers and simple obedience. Naaman listened to his servants. It was itself a mark of character that he could hear wisdom from those beneath him in status, that his pride could be penetrated by reasonable argument from subordinates. He went down to the Jordan, not the beautiful rivers of Damascus, but this specific, divinely appointed, unimpressive waterway, and he dipped himself 7 times according to the word of the man of God. 7 times, complete obedience, not 6 times, stopping short, not 8 times, adding to the prescription, exactly as the prophet had said. And with the 7th immersion, his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. The leprosy that had marked him, that had progressively destroyed him, that no physician could cure and no sacrifice could appease, it was gone. His skin was new, healthy, whole. The disease that had defined his limitations vanished with the 7th dip in the Jordan. Naaman returned to Elisha, but this time not with anger, but with wonder. He came with all his company, the same impressive retinue that had first approached the prophet's house, but now with a completely different attitude. He stood before Elisha and made a declaration that echoed through the centuries. Behold, I know that there is no God in all the earth but in Israel. It was a stunning confession from a foreign commander. Not, "I know your God is powerful," or "I know your prophet has great gifts, but I know there is no God in all the earth but in Israel." He had come believing in the gods of Damascus, in Rimmon the storm god whom he served as commander. He left believing that Yahweh alone was God, that all other deities were nothing, that the power he had experienced was not one power among many, but the only true divine power in existence. Then Naaman made an offer. "Now please accept a present from your servant." He had brought wealth, 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, 10 changes of clothing. It was a fortune, far more than typical payment for services rendered. But it was also a test, though Naaman did not know it. Would the prophet who commanded God's power also take payment for it? Would he treat healing as a transaction, a service rendered for appropriate compensation? Elisha's response was emphatic. "As the Lord lives, before whom I stand, I will receive none." Naaman urged him. The wealth was there. The gift was prepared. Surely the prophet deserved payment for such a miracle. But Elisha refused. The healing was not his to sell. The power was not his to monetize. He stood before the Lord, served at God's pleasure, spoke God's word. To accept payment would be to commodify grace, to turn divine gift into human transaction. But Naaman, transformed by healing and by the encounter with Israel's God, had one more request. "Then, if not, please let there be given to your servant 2 mule loads of earth. For from now on your servant will not offer burnt offering or sacrifice to any god but the Lord." It was a remarkable statement of intention. He would take Israelite soil back to Damascus, would use it to build an altar, would offer sacrifices to Yahweh alone. The reasoning reflected ancient Near Eastern theology. Gods were often associated with specific territories, and worshipping a foreign god in your own land sometimes involved using soil from that god's land to create sacred space. But then Naaman added a caveat, a realistic acknowledgement of the complexities he would face. "In this matter may the Lord pardon your servant. When? My master goes into the house of Rimmon to worship there, leaning on my arm, and I bow myself in the house of Rimmon. When I bow myself in the house of Rimmon, the Lord pardon your servant in this matter." As commander, he attended the king in the temple of Rimmon. He would physically bow when the king bowed, supporting his master's arm. He was not asking permission to worship Rimmon. He had just declared he would worship only Yahweh. But he was acknowledging the political reality that his position would require physical actions that might appear to compromise his newfound faith. Elisha's response was brief. "Go in peace." It was not explicit permission, not detailed casuistry about what compromises were acceptable. It was recognition that Naaman would have to work out his faith in his own context, that the God who had healed him would guide him in navigating the complex realities of life in a pagan court. The prophet who had refused payment did not demand perfect adherence to every detail of Israelite religious practice. The healing had happened. The confession had been made. The transformation was real. Let the man go in peace. So Naaman departed from Elisha, going only a short distance before disaster struck, not for him, but for the prophet's household. Gehazi, Elisha's servant who had carried messages and witnessed miracles for years, watched Naaman leave with all his wealth intact, and something twisted in his heart. "See, my master has spared this Aramean Naaman by not accepting from his hand what he brought. As the Lord lives, I will run after him and get something from him." The rationalization was complete. Elisha had been too generous, too principled. Why let all that wealth leave when it could benefit the prophetic community? Why refuse payment when payment was offered? Gehazi convinced himself that taking what Elisha had refused was somehow justified, that his master's integrity was admirable but impractical. He ran after Naaman, who saw him coming and got down from his chariot to meet him. "Is all well?" Naaman asked. Gehazi lied smoothly. "All is well. My master has sent me to say, there have just now come to me from the hill country of Ephraim 2 young men of the sons of the prophets. Please give them a talent of silver and 2 changes of clothing." Naaman, generous in his gratitude, urged him to take 2 talents. He had 2 talents of silver wrapped up in 2 bags, gave them with 2 changes of clothing, and sent 2 of his servants to carry them before Gehazi. When they came to the hill, Gehazi took the bags from them and deposited them in the house, then sent the men away. He went in and stood before his master, thinking his deception was complete, his theft accomplished without consequence. Elisha asked him, "Where have you been, Gehazi?" And Gehazi lied again. "Your servant went nowhere." The servant who had witnessed miracle after miracle, who had seen God's power demonstrated again and again, thought he could hide his actions from the prophet through whom God spoke. Elisha's response revealed he knew everything. "Did not my heart go with you when the man turned from his chariot to meet you? Is this a time to accept money and garments, olive orchards and vineyards, sheep and oxen, male servants and female servants?" The list extended beyond what Gehazi had actually taken. Elisha saw not just the immediate theft, but the trajectory of greed. What Gehazi planned to do with the money, how one compromise would lead to others, then the judgment. "Therefore the leprosy of Naaman shall cling to you and to your descendants forever." The disease that had been cleansed from the Aramean commander through grace was now transferred to the Israelite servant through greed. Gehazi went out from Elisha's presence a leper, as white as snow. The man who had witnessed miracles of provision and healing became himself the object of judgment, marked for life by the consequences of his corruption. The contrast between Naaman and Gehazi was devastating. Naaman, the foreign commander who knew nothing of Yahweh, encountered grace, believed, was healed, and went away confessing the one true God. Gehazi, the prophet's servant who had access to spiritual power and divine truth, saw miracles daily but remained unchanged in heart, corrupted by greed, struck with the very disease the foreigner had been cured of. The story raised uncomfortable questions about proximity to power versus transformation of heart. Gehazi had been closer to Elisha than anyone, had witnessed more miracles than most people would see in a lifetime, had carried messages and participated in extraordinary demonstrations of divine power. Yet none of it had changed his fundamental character. He remained greedy, deceptive, willing to corrupt the ministry he served for personal gain. Naaman had been a distant foreigner, an enemy commander, a man who worshipped false gods and knew nothing of Israel's covenant. Yet one encounter with grace, one experience of healing, one demonstration of God's power, and he left declaring the uniqueness of Yahweh, taking soil to build an altar, committing himself to worship the God of Israel alone. The message was clear and sobering. Access to spiritual privilege does not guarantee spiritual transformation. Being near the man of God is not the same as becoming godly. Witnessing miracles does not automatically produce faith. Gehazi had everything Naaman lacked: proximity, knowledge, access, and yet Naaman received what Gehazi missed: genuine encounter with God that changed everything. The healing of Naaman demonstrated that God's mercy extended beyond Israel's borders, that his power could reach into foreign lands, that his grace was available even to enemy commanders. But it also demonstrated the cost of corrupting that grace, of treating divine gifts as opportunities for profit, of allowing greed to poison what should be channels of blessing. Elisha had refused payment because healing was gift, not transaction. The power of God was not for sale. To accept money would be to suggest that Naaman's healing was a service rendered rather than grace extended, that the prophet's power was something that could be purchased rather than divine authority that operated according to God's will alone. Gehazi's theft violated this principle at its core. By taking payment that Elisha had refused, he was retroactively commodifying grace, turning gift into transaction, suggesting that healing had a price after all. It just required going behind the prophet's back to pay it. He corrupted the witness of the miracle, made the healing seem less like divine compassion and more like a service that commanded appropriate fees. And so the leprosy that had been lifted from the foreigner fell on the servant, a visible demonstration that God's gifts cannot be corrupted without consequence, that greed poisons the soul more surely than disease poisons the body. That proximity to spiritual power without transformation of character leads not to blessing, but to judgment. The story ended with Naaman heading back to Damascus, healed and transformed, carrying Israelite soil to build an altar to the God who had shown him mercy. And Gehazi, white with leprosy, marked for life by the consequences of his greed, a walking testament to the truth that witnessing miracles is not the same as experiencing transformation, that being close to God's power is not the same as being changed by it. The God of Israel had demonstrated his supremacy over disease, his mercy toward foreigners, his power that transcended national boundaries. The prophet who commanded that power had demonstrated integrity that refused payment, discernment that saw hidden actions, authority to pronounce judgment on corruption. And the servant who should have known better learned too late that some things are too precious to steal, some grace too sacred to commodify, some holiness too dangerous to approach with unclean hands. The conflict between Israel and Aram was not constant war, but a series of raids and skirmishes, the kind of persistent, low-intensity conflict that marked relations between neighbouring kingdoms in the ancient Near East. The king of Aram would plan military operations, position his forces strategically, prepare to ambush Israelite forces or raid vulnerable towns. But again and again his plans failed. Again and again Israel seemed to know exactly where Aramean forces would be, avoided the traps, evaded the ambushes, frustrated every strategy. The king of Aram called his servants together, furious and suspicious. "Tell me, who among us is for the king of Israel?" There had to be a traitor, he reasoned. Someone in his inner circle was betraying his plans to the enemy. How else could Israel consistently know his movements, anticipate his strategies, avoid his forces? The assumption was logical. When secrets leak, look for the leak. But one of his servants answered with information that must have seemed incredible. "None, my lord, O king. But Elisha, the prophet who is in Israel, tells the king of Israel the words that you speak in your bedroom." It was an extraordinary claim. Not that there was a spy in the Aramean camp, but that there was a prophet in Israel who heard things supernaturally, who knew the king's secret plans without any natural means of knowing them, who could reveal to Israel's king the very words spoken in private chambers. The king's response showed he took the claim seriously. If Elisha could know his plans, if the prophet was the source of Israel's intelligence advantage, then the solution was clear. Eliminate the prophet. "Go and see where he is, that I may send and seize him." His servants reported back, "Behold, he is in Dothan." Dothan was a small town in northern Israel north of Samaria, a place of no particular strategic importance. But if the prophet was there, if the man who foiled every Aramean plan was in that town, then Dothan suddenly became the most important target in Israel. The king of Aram sent a strong force, horses, chariots, a substantial military expedition to capture one man. They came by night, surrounding the city, establishing a perimeter that would prevent escape. When morning came, Dothan was encircled by an Aramean army. Elisha's servant, the text does not name him, though it may have been the same one who replaced Gehazi, rose early and went out. What he saw must have stopped his heart. Horses and chariots everywhere, Aramean soldiers surrounding the city, the full might of a military force deployed to capture them. They were trapped, outnumbered, doomed. The servant ran back to Elisha in panic. "Alas, my master! What shall we do?" It was the cry of someone who saw only the visible reality, who calculated odds based on what eyes could see, who assessed their situation by the natural evidence. And by those measures their situation was hopeless. They were two men, a prophet and his servant, surrounded by an army. There was no escape, no possibility of resistance, no reasonable hope of survival. But Elisha's response revealed a completely different perspective. "Do not be afraid, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them." It must have sounded like madness to the servant. Those who are with us? There was no us. There was just the two of them, unarmed and surrounded. The Arameans were many. They were few. The enemy had horses and chariots. They had nothing. How could Elisha possibly claim that those with them outnumbered those against them? Then Elisha prayed, and the prayer revealed the problem. "O Lord, please open his eyes that he may see." The servant's eyes were working perfectly in the natural sense. He had seen the Aramean forces clearly enough. But spiritual sight was something else entirely. There was a reality beyond what natural eyes could perceive, a dimension of existence that required divine revelation to see, and that reality made all the difference. The Lord opened the servant's eyes, and suddenly he saw what had been there all along, invisible to natural sight but more real than the visible army. The mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. The angelic army of the Lord, the forces of heaven, the spiritual reality that surrounded the prophet, they vastly outnumbered the Aramean forces that had seemed so overwhelming moments before. It was a paradigm shift, a complete reversal of perception. What appeared to be hopeless was actually secure. What looked like desperate odds was actually overwhelming advantage. The servant had been focused on the visible enemies and missed the invisible allies. He had calculated based on what he could see and completely missed what mattered most. The vision did not change the situation. The angelic army had been there before the servant saw them. It changed his perception of the situation, allowed him to see reality as it actually was rather than as it appeared, to understand that the visible world is not the sum total of existence, that spiritual forces are more determinative than physical ones. But Elisha was not done. The Arameans came down against him. Whether they saw the angelic army or not, the text does not say. And Elisha prayed again. This time the prayer was different. Please strike this people with blindness. And God struck them with blindness according to the word of Elisha. The army that had come to capture the prophet could no longer see where they were going, could not identify their target, could not coordinate their efforts. The very sense they had relied on to surround the city was taken from them. Then Elisha did something audacious. He went out to the blind army and spoke to them. This is not the way, and this is not the city. Follow me, and I will bring you to the man whom you seek. It was technically true. They were no longer in the right way or the right city once they started following him. But it was also magnificently deceptive. The man they sought was the one speaking to them, leading them, taking them exactly where he wanted them to go. And where did Elisha lead them? Not away from danger, not to some remote location where they could be released without consequence. He led them into Samaria, the capital of Israel, into the heart of enemy territory, directly to the king of Israel himself. The Aramean force that had come to capture one prophet now found themselves captured, delivered into the hands of their enemies by the very man they had sought to seize. When they arrived in Samaria, Elisha prayed again, "O Lord, open the eyes of these men that they may see." And the Lord opened their eyes, and behold, they were in the midst of Samaria. The blindness lifted, sight returned, and with it the horrifying realization of their situation. They had been led by their enemy into his capital city. They were surrounded by Israelite forces. They were completely at the mercy of the people they had come to attack. The king of Israel, seeing this Aramean force suddenly delivered into his hands, asked Elisha eagerly, "My father, shall I strike them down? Shall I strike them down?" The temptation must have been overwhelming. Here were enemy soldiers in his capital, helpless, vulnerable. He could eliminate them with a word, could strike a blow against Aram without risk to his own forces. The opportunity was too good to waste. But Elisha's response revealed a different wisdom. "You shall not strike them down. Would you strike down those whom you have taken captive with your sword and with your bow? Set bread and water before them, that they may eat and drink and go to their master." The logic was clear. These men had not been captured through Israel's military prowess. They had not been defeated in battle by Israelite weapons. They had been delivered by God through prophetic word. To kill them would be to claim credit for a victory that was not Israel's to claim, to respond to divine mercy with human violence. Instead, Elisha commanded radical hospitality. Feed them, give them drink, send them home. The king obeyed. He prepared a great feast for them, not merely basic rations but abundant provision, a demonstration of generosity that would shame their hostile intent. They ate and drank, and then he sent them to their master. The Aramean soldiers who had come to capture the prophet returned home with an unforgettable story. They had been struck blind, led into the enemy capital, fed at the enemy's table, and sent home unharmed. The effect was immediate and lasting. The Syrians did not come again on raids into the land of Israel. The low-intensity conflict that had plagued the border, the constant threat of Aramean incursions, the cycle of raid and counter-raid, it stopped. Not because Israel had demonstrated superior military might, not because Aram had been defeated in battle, not because some political settlement had been negotiated. The raid stopped because the Aramean forces had experienced something they could not explain, had encountered a power they could not combat, had been shown mercy when they deserved death. The story operated on multiple levels. On the surface, it was a demonstration of God's power to protect his prophet, to frustrate the plans of enemies, to deliver his servants from seemingly impossible situations. But it went deeper than that. It revealed the reality of the spiritual dimension that exists alongside and above the physical world. The servant saw Aramean horses and chariots and panicked, because he was assessing the situation based only on what natural eyes could see. But when his spiritual eyes were opened, he saw that the visible reality was only part, and not even the most important part, of what was actually happening. The angelic forces surrounding Elisha vastly outnumbered the human forces threatening him. This principle applied far beyond one incident in Dothan. Throughout history, God's people have faced situations where the visible circumstances seemed overwhelming, where the odds appeared impossible, where natural assessment suggested defeat was inevitable. And throughout history, the testimony has been the same. Those who are with us are more than those who are with them. The spiritual forces aligned with God's purposes are greater than any earthly opposition. The angelic armies of the Lord outnumber all human forces combined. But seeing this reality requires spiritual sight. The servant needed his eyes opened. He needed divine revelation to perceive what was there all along. Faith is not pretending that threats don't exist, or minimizing real dangers. Faith is seeing the whole picture, perceiving both the visible and the invisible, understanding that spiritual realities are more determinative than physical ones. The story also demonstrated the power of mercy over vengeance. The king of Israel's instinct was to strike down the captive Arameans. It made strategic sense. Eliminate enemy soldiers without risk to your own forces. It satisfied justice. They had come to attack. Let them pay the price. It followed conventional military wisdom. Seize every advantage, press every opportunity. Show no mercy to those who would show none to you. But Elisha commanded a different response. Feed them and send them home. It seemed counterintuitive, even dangerous. Release enemy soldiers to fight another day? Let them return to report on Samaria's defences? Waste resources feeding those who came to destroy you? By conventional wisdom, it was foolishness. Yet the outcome vindicated the strategy. The mercy shown to the Aramean forces accomplished what military victory could not. It ended the cycle of raids, created a period of peace, demonstrated a power that military might alone could not convey. The soldiers who were fed and released became witnesses to Israel's God, testimonies to his power and his mercy. They had experienced something that transcended normal warfare, had encountered a reality that changed how they thought about Israel and Israel's God. This did not mean Aram became a permanent ally, or that conflict never arose again. The text notes that afterward, King Ben-Hadad of Aram gathered his entire army and besieged Samaria. But even that siege, as devastating as it was, did not involve the same kind of constant raiding that had characterized earlier Aramean-Israelite relations. Something had shifted. Some barrier had been crossed. Some message had been communicated through the extraordinary mercy shown to the blind soldiers. The incident in Dothan also revealed Elisha's unique position. He was not a military commander, not a political strategist, not even primarily a counselor to kings. He was a prophet, one who saw what others could not see, who operated with authority that transcended human power structures, who commanded both the angelic armies of heaven and the attention of earthly rulers. His prayer could open eyes to see the invisible or close eyes to create blindness. His word could lead enemy armies wherever he chose. His instruction could override the king's natural military instincts. He operated in a realm where the usual rules did not apply, where spiritual authority trumped political or military power, where God's purposes were accomplished through means that defied conventional wisdom. This was the double portion working itself out over decades of ministry. Elisha performed miracles of provision and healing, yes, multiplying oil, raising the dead, purifying water, feeding prophets. But he also operated in the realm of international conflict, shaping outcomes that affected nations, demonstrating that the God of Israel was sovereign not just in personal matters, but in geopolitical realities. These servants' panic at seeing the Aramean army reflected a perspective that many share. Assessment of situations based purely on visible factors, calculation of odds based on what can be naturally perceived, evaluation of possibilities based on human resources and limitations. From that perspective, being surrounded by an enemy army is cause for terror. The situation is hopeless, the outcome inevitable. But Elisha's perspective was different. He saw the same physical circumstances, but interpreted them through spiritual reality. Yes, there was an Aramean army, but there was also an angelic army. Yes, they were surrounded, but they were surrounded by forces far greater than those threatening them. Yes, humanly speaking, they were in danger, but spiritually speaking, they were completely secure. The prayer, "Open his eyes that he may see," was not a request for better physical vision, but for spiritual perception. The servant's eyes were working fine. His perception of reality was incomplete. He needed to see not different things, but the same things differently, to understand that the visible world is embedded in an invisible reality, that spiritual forces are more powerful than physical ones, that God's presence with his prophet was more significant than any human military force. This truth has sustained believers through millennia of persecution, trial, and apparent defeat. When early Christians faced Roman power, when medieval believers endured plague and war, when modern Christians face hostile governments and violent opposition, the promise remains. Those who are with us are more than those who are with them. The visible opposition, however overwhelming, is not the full picture. Angelic forces surround God's people. Spiritual resources exceed natural ones. The eyes of faith perceive what natural sight cannot. But the story also contained a warning. Those who came against God's prophet were struck with blindness, led into enemy territory, made helpless before those they had sought to harm. The power that protected could also punish. The prophet who commanded angelic armies could also command blindness and confusion for those who opposed God's purposes. Mercy was offered, but mercy from a position of strength, mercy that demonstrated power even as it extended grace. The Aramean soldiers returned home with a story that would be retold around fires and in royal courts. They had been sent to capture a prophet, had been struck blind, had been led into the enemy capital, had been fed at the enemy king's table, and had been released unharmed. It was not a story of military defeat. They had not been overcome by superior forces or outmaneuvered by brilliant strategy. It was a story of supernatural intervention, of encountering a power that transcended normal categories, of experiencing mercy that shamed their hostile intent. What did they tell their families? How did they explain what had happened? The man they had been sent to capture had captured them instead, not with weapons, but with words, not through violence, but through power that operated on a completely different level than military might. And then, rather than destroying them as they deserved, he had commanded that they be fed and released. The story accomplished what military victory alone could not. It testified to the reality of Israel's God, demonstrated that Yahweh was not merely one God among many, but a power that transcended normal categories, showed that those who served him had access to resources beyond human calculation. The Aramean forces had encountered something they could not explain, experienced something they could not replicate, witnessed power that belonged to a different order of reality altogether. And so, the raid stopped, not because Aram lacked the military capacity to continue them, not because political circumstances made them impractical, but because the soldiers had learned something that changed their calculus. The prophet in Israel knew their plans before they executed them, commanded forces they could not see, wielded power they could not counter. Better to leave him alone than to face again what they had faced at Dothan. The invisible army remained invisible to most. The angelic forces that surrounded Elisha did not become generally visible, did not ride into battle where all could see them, did not make themselves known except in that one revelatory moment when the servant's eyes were opened. They operated in the spiritual dimension, accomplishing God's purposes, protecting his servants, ensuring that his will was done regardless of human opposition or earthly power. But their invisibility did not make them less real. The servant learned that morning what prophets and believers throughout history have learned. The unseen is more substantial than the seen, the spiritual more enduring than the physical, the eternal more significant than the temporal. What eyes can perceive is only a fraction of reality. What faith understands is the fuller picture, the deeper truth, the reality that encompasses and transcends the visible world. Elisha's ministry demonstrated this truth again and again. He saw what others could not see, knew what others could not know, operated with authority that came from beyond the human realm. The double portion he had requested was not merely doubling of miracles, but doubling of perception, of authority, of effectiveness in accomplishing God's purposes. Where Elijah had worked primarily through dramatic confrontation and spectacular displays, Elisha worked through sustained ministry that operated simultaneously in the visible and invisible realms, that addressed both physical and spiritual realities, that brought heaven's resources to bear on earth's problems. The king of Israel, who wanted to strike down the captive Arameans, learned that day what Naaman had learned earlier. God's ways are not human ways. God's wisdom often contradicts human wisdom, and obedience to prophetic instruction produces results that human strategy cannot achieve. The feast he prepared for enemy soldiers seemed wasteful, dangerous, foolish, but it accomplished peace where violence would have perpetuated conflict, created testimony where vengeance would have created only more enemies. The invisible army had protected the prophet, the blindness had captured the attackers, the mercy had ended the raids, and through it all the man of God had demonstrated that those who serve the Lord of heaven's armies need fear no earthly force, that spiritual resources exceed material ones, that eyes open to see reality as it truly is will never again panic at merely visible threats. The mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire. They were there before the servant saw them. They remained there after the vision ended. The angelic forces did not come and go based on human perception. They operated according to God's will, protecting his servants, accomplishing his purposes, ensuring that despite all earthly opposition, his word through his prophet would stand, and his purposes would prevail. And Israel learned once again that the prophet among them was more valuable than all their armies, that the word of God through his servant was more powerful than the weapons of war, that the nation's true security lay not in military might or political alliances, but in faithfulness to the God who commanded both earthly and heavenly armies, who could open eyes to see or strike with blindness, who could command angels to protect or enemies to be captured, whose purposes would be accomplished regardless of opposition, because he alone was Lord, sovereign over all powers visible and invisible, temporal and eternal, earthly and heavenly. The years passed, and with them the seasons of Elisha's long ministry. He had witnessed the fall of the house of Ahab, the rise and reign of Jehu, the succession of kings who came and went while the prophet remained, a constant presence speaking God's word to a nation that alternately listened and ignored, honoured and despised, sought and rejected him. His hair, once the dark of youth, had greyed and whitened. His body, once vigorous enough to travel constantly between prophetic communities and royal courts, began to show the wear of decades of service. But the ministry did not stop. Even as Elisha aged, even as his physical strength waned, the prophetic word continued to flow through him. The double portion he had requested so many years ago at the Jordan remained active, continued to manifest in miracles and prophecies that demonstrated God's power was not diminished by the prophet's advancing years. Yet not all of Elisha's later ministry was marked by miracles of mercy. There were darker episodes, reminders that prophetic authority encompassed judgment as well as grace. One of the most harrowing occurred during a siege of Samaria by King Ben-Hadad of Aram. The siege was so severe, so prolonged, that famine gripped the city with devastating force. The prices recorded in the text reveal the desperation. A donkey's head sold for 80 shekels of silver, a small portion of dove's dung for 5 shekels. People were eating what should never be eaten, paying fortunes for what had no nutritional value, driven to extremes by hunger that seemed endless. The king of Israel was walking on the wall when a woman cried out to him. "Help, my lord, O king!" He replied with bitter resignation. "If the Lord will not help you, how shall I help you?" From the threshing floor or from the winepress? There was no grain to thresh, no grapes to press. The resources were exhausted. He had nothing to give. But then he asked what her trouble was, and her answer revealed the depths of horror to which the siege had driven them. She and another woman had made an agreement. They would eat her son one day, and the other woman's son the next day. They had boiled and eaten her son. But when it came time to eat the other woman's son, that woman had hidden him. The cannibalism that Deuteronomy had warned would come upon covenant breakers if they abandoned God. It was happening in Israel's capital. When the king heard this, he tore his clothes, revealing that underneath his royal garments he wore sackcloth next to his skin. He had been mourning, had been desperate, had been trying to humble himself before God even as he wore his kingly robes in public. But his response to this horror was not prayer, but rage. May God do so to me and more also, if the head of Elisha the son of Shaphat remains on his shoulders today. It was a stunning reversal. The king blamed the prophet for the disaster, held Elisha responsible for the suffering, determined to execute the man of God as if killing the messenger would solve the crisis. The logic was twisted but understandable in its desperation. Elisha had prophesied victories, had promised provision, had claimed to speak for God. Where was God now? Why was this happening? If the prophet represented God, then let the prophet die for God's apparent abandonment. Elisha was sitting in his house with the elders when he perceived that the king had sent an executioner. "See how this murderer has sent to take off my head," he said to the elders around him. "Look, when the messenger comes, shut the door and hold the door fast against him. Is not the sound of his master's feet behind him?" The prophet knew what was coming, knew the king's intent, yet remained calm, instructed the elders to bar the door, waited for what would unfold. The messenger arrived, and behind him came the king himself, his rage somewhat cooled, but his despair complete. "This trouble is from the Lord. Why should I wait for the Lord any longer?" It was the cry of someone who had reached the end of faith, who saw no purpose in continued trust, who interpreted suffering as divine abandonment. If God was causing this disaster, why pray for deliverance? If the Lord had determined their destruction, why maintain hope? But Elisha responded with a prophecy that defied everything their circumstances suggested. "Hear the word of the Lord. Thus says the Lord, tomorrow. About this time a seah of fine flour shall be sold for a shekel, and 2 seahs of barley for a shekel at the gate of Samaria." Within 24 hours the famine prices would be reversed. Abundance would replace scarcity. The siege that seemed unbreakable would be broken. One of the king's officers, the one on whose hand the king leaned, responded with skepticism. If the Lord himself should make windows in heaven, could this thing be? It was a dismissal wrapped in a rhetorical question, the kind of sarcasm that masks fear that hope might be false. Even if God worked a spectacular miracle, even if provision came from heaven itself, how could such a dramatic reversal happen so quickly? Elisha's response was prophetic and sobering. "You shall see it with your own eyes, but you shall not eat of it." The officer would witness the fulfillment but not benefit from it. He would see the prophecy come true but would not survive to enjoy the abundance. Skepticism would cost him his life. That night the Lord caused the Aramean army to hear the sound of chariots and horses, the sound of a great army. They said to one another, "Behold, the king of Israel has hired against us the kings of the Hittites and the kings of Egypt to come upon us." Panic seized them. They fled in the twilight, abandoning their tents, their horses, their donkeys, the entire camp as it stood, running for their lives from an army that existed only in their ears. 4 lepers were sitting at the entrance of the gate, men who were outcasts, not allowed in the city, surviving on whatever scraps they could obtain. They reasoned together, "Why are we sitting here until we die? If we say, 'Let us enter the city,' the famine is in the city, and we shall die there. And if we sit here, we die also. So now come, let us go over to the camp of the Syrians. If they spare our lives, we shall live, and if they kill us, we shall but die." It was the logic of those who had nothing to lose. They were dying anyway. Why not take a chance? They went to the Aramean camp at twilight and found it deserted. Tents stood empty. Food and water sat untouched. Horses and donkeys remained tethered. The lepers went into tent after tent, eating and drinking, carrying off silver and gold and clothing, hiding the plunder and returning for more. Then conscience struck them. "We are not doing right. This is a day of good news. If we are silent and wait until the morning light, punishment will overtake us. Now therefore come, let us go and tell the king's household." They went and called to the gatekeepers of the city and reported what they had found. The king rose in the night, suspicious. "I will tell you what the Syrians have done to us. They know that we are hungry. Therefore they have gone out of the camp to hide themselves in the open country, thinking, 'When they come out of the city, we shall take them alive and get into the city.'" It seemed a plausible trap. Pretend to flee, wait for desperate Israelites to emerge, then ambush them. But one of his servants suggested a test. Let some men take 5 of the remaining horses, seeing that those who are left here will fare like the whole multitude of Israel who have already perished. Let us send and see. So they sent scouts who followed the trail of the fleeing Arameans all the way to the Jordan, the road littered with garments and equipment the army had thrown away in their panicked flight. The scouts returned and reported, and the people went out and plundered the camp of the Arameans. Exactly as Elisha had prophesied, a sea of fine flour was sold for a shekel, and 2 seahs of barley for a shekel. The famine ended in a day. Abundance replaced scarcity. The siege was broken not by military victory but by divine intervention that created panic where there should have been confidence. The king appointed the officer on whose hand he leaned to have charge of the gate, but the people trampled him in the gate as they rushed out to the Aramean camp, and he died. He saw the prophecy fulfilled, witnessed the abundance, watched the famine end, but died in the crush of the people seeking food. Exactly as Elisha had said, "You shall see it with your own eyes, but you shall not eat of it." These were the kinds of incidents that marked Elisha's later years. Prophecies fulfilled to the letter, divine intervention in seemingly hopeless situations, judgment on skepticism, mercy to outcasts like the lepers who stumbled upon salvation and had the integrity to share it. The prophet's word continued to shape events. His connection to God remained unbroken. The double portion continued to operate even as his physical strength declined. But the years were taking their toll. Elisha, who had witnessed Elijah taken to heaven in a whirlwind, who had parted the Jordan with the fallen mantle, who had performed more miracles than any prophet before or after him, he was growing old. The vigour that had allowed him to travel constantly between communities was fading. The body that had served the prophetic calling for so long was wearing out. Eventually Elisha became ill with the illness of which he would die. The text is matter-of-fact about it, almost stark in its brevity. There was no dramatic ascension for him as there had been for Elijah, no chariot of fire, no whirlwind to heaven, no translation that bypassed death. The man who had raised others from death would himself pass through death's door like any other mortal. Joash, king of Israel, heard that the prophet was dying and came down to him. When he saw Elisha on his sickbed, he wept and cried out, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen." It was the same cry Elisha had uttered when Elijah was taken, the same recognition that the prophet was Israel's true defence, more valuable than all their military might, more essential to national security than horses and chariots and armies. Elisha, even in his final illness, had one more prophecy to deliver, one more demonstration of how God would work through Israel if they would trust him. He said to the king, "Take a bow and arrows." Joash took them. "Draw the bow," Elisha commanded, and the king drew it. Then Elisha laid his hands on the king's hands, a symbolic transfer, a prophetic reinforcement, a demonstration that divine power worked through human action. "Open the window eastward," Elisha instructed. The king opened it. "Shoot," said Elisha, and Joash shot an arrow into the eastern sky. toward Aram, toward the enemy that had oppressed Israel for so long. As the arrow flew, Elisha proclaimed its meaning. The Lord's arrow of victory, the arrow of victory over Syria, for you shall fight the Syrians in Aphek until you have made an end of them. Then Elisha commanded, "Take the arrows." Joash took them. "Strike the ground with them," Elisha said. The king struck the ground 3 times and stopped. It seemed sufficient. 3 strikes, 3 victories, a good showing. But Elisha was angry, his final burst of prophetic passion emerging even in his weakness. "You should have struck 5 or 6 times," the prophet rebuked. "Then you would have struck down Syria until you had made an end of it. But now you will strike down Syria only 3 times. The half-hearted obedience, the stopping short, the failure to press through to complete victory, it limited what God could do through the king." The prophet's instruction had not specified how many times to strike, had left it to the king's faith and determination to decide, and the king had stopped too soon, satisfied with partial victory rather than pressing for total triumph. It was Elisha's final recorded prophecy, and it contained within it the tragedy that had marked Israel throughout its history. People who had access to God's power, but who used it half-heartedly, who obeyed partially, who stopped short of what could have been accomplished if they had fully committed. The arrows represented battles, victories over Aram that God was offering. The king could have struck the ground repeatedly, could have claimed complete victory, could have prophesied through his actions the total defeat of Israel's enemy. Instead, he struck 3 times and stopped, and so Israel would win 3 battles, but not achieve the decisive victory that could have been theirs. Then Elisha died, and they buried him. The prophet who had ministered for approximately 50 years, who had served through the reigns of Jehoram, Jehu, Jehoahaz, and into the reign of Joash, who had performed 16 recorded miracles to Elijah's 8, who had operated in both mercy and judgment, who had counselled kings and provided for widows, who had raised the dead and struck armies blind, who had multiplied oil and purified water and ended famines and shaped the political destiny of nations. He was laid in a tomb, his body committed to the earth like any other mortal. But even death could not end the power that had worked through him. The text preserves one final, extraordinary incident. Moabite raiders used to invade the land in the spring. On one such raid, some Israelites were burying a man when they saw a band of raiders coming. In their panic, they threw the dead body into Elisha's tomb. When the body touched the bones of Elisha, the man revived and stood up on his feet. It was an astounding miracle, unparalleled in Scripture. The prophet had raised the dead during his lifetime. Now his very bones, long after his death, still carried resurrection power. It was not that the bones themselves were magical. The text makes clear this was God's power, the same power that had worked through Elisha, while he lived, continuing to operate even after his death. But the symbolism was profound. The prophet's influence outlasted his life. The power he had carried continued beyond his mortal existence. The legacy he had built did not die with him. The incident testified to several truths at once. It demonstrated that God's power was not dependent on the prophet being alive. The same God who had worked through Elisha's ministry could work through his memory, his legacy, his very remains. It showed that prophetic authority extended beyond the grave, that the impact of a life lived in obedience to God's calling rippled forward through time. It proclaimed that death was not the final word, that the God who had raised people through his prophet was the God of resurrection, the Lord of a life who could bring life from death. But it also highlighted the tragedy of what might have been if Israel had fully embraced what God offered through his prophet. For 50 years, they had access to this man through whom such power flowed. For 5 decades, they could have sought his counsel, heeded his warnings, followed his instructions completely rather than partially. They could have pressed for total victory rather than settling for partial success. They could have transformed their nation rather than merely surviving their crises. Instead, they used Elisha as a resource for emergencies, a trump card to play when situations became desperate, a spiritual fix-it man to solve problems they had often created through their own disobedience. They sought his help when they needed water in the wilderness but ignored his calls to faithfulness. They came to him when famine threatened, but returned to their idolatry when the crisis passed. They wept over his deathbed and recognized him as the chariots of Israel and its horsemen, but they had never fully committed to the God whose power worked through him. Elisha's ministry stood as testimony to both divine grace and human failure. God had been incredibly generous to Israel, giving them prophet after prophet, performing miracle after miracle, providing for them, protecting them, guiding them, demonstrating his power and his compassion again and again. Elisha alone had performed more miracles than any prophet before or after him, had operated in mercy toward enemies like Naaman and the blind Aramean soldiers, had provided for widows and raised children from death, had ended famines and multiplied food, had shaped military outcomes and political transitions. Yet Israel remained largely unchanged. They still clung to the calf worship Jeroboam had established. They still made political alliances that betrayed lack of trust in God. They still sought prophetic help in crises while ignoring prophetic instruction in everyday life. They still stopped short of complete obedience, striking the ground 3 times when they should have struck 6 times, content with partial victory when total triumph was offered. The prophet's final years had been marked by this same pattern: extraordinary divine provision met with half-hearted human response. The siege of Samaria ended with abundance just as prophesied, but the officer who doubted died in the fulfillment. The king wept over the dying prophet and called him Israel's true defense, but the same king struck the ground only 3 times, limiting the victory God wanted to give. When Elisha died, Israel lost its most powerful spiritual resource, the man who could know enemy plans before they were executed, who could call down blindness on armies and resurrection on the dead, who could multiply food and purify water and end droughts with a word. He was gone. No immediate successor arose to fill his role. The prophetic voice that had spoken for 50 years fell silent. Or did it? The bones that brought life to a dead man suggested otherwise. The legacy of miracles testified to something that outlasted mortal life. The stories that would be told and retold about the prophet's ministry kept his witness alive. The demonstration that God's power could work through human vessels, that divine authority could operate through faithful servants, that even in a nation that repeatedly turned away from him, God would continue to provide prophets and perform miracles and offer grace. This testimony did not die with Elisha. In the Jewish tradition, Elisha would be remembered with honor as the man of God, the prophet whose ministry exemplified both power and compassion. The title, Man of God, appears 29 times in the narratives about him, more than for any other prophet, a recognition that his life was so thoroughly oriented toward divine purposes that his very identity was defined by his relationship with God. In Christian tradition, he would be seen as a type, a foreshadowing of Christ, one who healed the sick, raised the dead, multiplied food, showed mercy to enemies, and whose power extended even beyond death. But also as a contrast, where Elisha's ministry was mighty, Jesus's would be mightier. Where Elisha raised one child, Jesus would raise several. Where Elisha's power brought life to one who touched his bones, Jesus' resurrection would bring life to all who touch him by faith. But Elisha's legacy was not primarily in his miracles, as spectacular as they were. It was in his faithfulness. 50 years of ministry, through multiple kings and countless crises, serving when honoured and when ignored, speaking God's word when it was welcomed and when it was rejected, demonstrating day after day, year after year, decade after decade, that the God of Israel was present, powerful, compassionate, sovereign, and worthy of complete trust. The double portion he had requested at the Jordan had been granted. The ministry he had been called to had been fulfilled. The prophetic authority he had inherited from Elijah had been exercised faithfully. And when he died, though there was no whirlwind to carry him to heaven, though his body was committed to a tomb like any other, the power of God that had worked through him continued to testify, continued to call Israel to faithfulness, continued to demonstrate that the God who raised the dead through his prophet's bones was the God of resurrection, of life, of hope beyond the grave. The prophet was dead, But his witness lived on. His miracles testified to God's power. His compassion testified to God's mercy. His faithfulness testified to the possibility of a life lived in complete obedience to divine calling. And even his bones testified to the truth that had marked his entire ministry. The God of Israel was not dead, not absent, not powerless, but living and active, working through his servants, accomplishing his purposes, extending his grace to those who would receive it. Elisha, who had followed Elijah from the plough, who had refused to leave his master's side through 3 attempts at dismissal, who had witnessed the chariot of fire and inherited the fallen mantle, who had parted the Jordan and performed miracles of mercy and power for 5 decades. He rested with his fathers, his body in the tomb, his legacy in the hearts of those who had witnessed his ministry, his testimony in the scriptures that would preserve his story for all generations. The strongest prophet in terms of sheer number of miracles had finished his race. The faithful servant who had carried Elijah's mantle with honour had laid it down. The man of God had completed the ministry he had been called to, had demonstrated the double portion, had shown Israel again and again what it looked like when God's power worked through human faithfulness. And somewhere, in the purposes of God, his witness continued. In the stories told, the lessons learned, the testimony preserved, the truth demonstrated, that God can work through anyone who will fully commit, that obedience opens the door to divine power, that faithfulness is rewarded with fruitfulness, and that even death cannot end the impact of a life lived in complete surrender to the calling of God.